Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another AGE Pro Team Deck Tech. It is late on a Wednesday evening, and I'm here with my friend and colleague from the AGE Pro Team, a face that is by no means unfamiliar to anybody that watches this channel. You saw him earlier as the winner of Battle Hardened Amsterdam on none other than Kano Drakai of Aether, probably the hero he is most known for. But today we are talking about a very different wizard, and this is the Wizard Master himself, Alexander Vore.
Thanks, Bryce. Pleasure to be here.
Really glad you're here and talking about a very fringe pick for the World Championship that we just had in Osaka, not but a couple weeks ago. You elected to bring Oscilio Constella Intelligence to this tournament, which I think would have been thought of as a very off-kilter, off-meta choice. Can you tell me about why you decided to bring Oscilio?
Yeah, well, Bryce, I really just can't bring myself to play good decks at the World Championship, is I think what I've decided. But I guess I ended up kind of switching to Acilio a little bit later in the testing process. Like for most of the time leading up to Worlds, I was like, okay, practicing Kano. I think it's okay. And then I kind of came to the acceptance stage. I got past denial. I came to acceptance. I was like, well, Kano's okay, but you need a very technical plan. You have to play games insanely well. And even then, you're like maybe 50-50 into a lot of things. And it really wasn't where I wanted to be. So I was looking at alternatives, playing wizards like Verdant, Sicilio, some other decks, things like that. And I ended up kind of liking the play style of Acilio, thinking that he had a lot more game than people expected. I don't think by any means he was the best deck of the format or anything like that, but I think he was competitive. And I think that he was probably one of the few decks you could have brought to the tournament and gained a non-zero amount of equity from people not having the experience into him and not knowing how to sideboard or maybe play into him, which I think was evident in a lot of the games I did end up playing.
Indeed. And before we get really into the nitty gritty of what Acilio even is, what he's trying to do, because that is probably an unfamiliar concept to a lot of people, given that he just hasn't had a very large amount of the meta share. People are much more used to decks like Aurora, Viserai, Count Your Blessings Enigma at this point, etc. Before we get into all that, Alex, how did you enjoy your time in Osaka?
It was fantastic. The weather was great, which is always nice. The food was fantastic.
And
A
cheap.
lot of yeah, true. That's always nice. A scene change from Amsterdam, let's say. But always good to get together with all the friends, team members, just people in the broader community. So I had a real blast there. The tournament weekend itself was nice, and then the time I spent kind of just traveling around Japan. It was my first time there, so I also had a really great time there.
Did you get a lot of time outside of the tournament to enjoy Japan?
We had a little bit. The primary focus was the tournament, and then a day and a half, 2 days on kind of travel tourism stuff. So like we went to Osaka Castle, some of the like temples and stuff. Went around to like the Hitachi Tower, I think it was, and some of the like market districts and stuff. It was a unique experience, and I'm grateful that I was able to go through that.
Yeah, Osaka's a little bit different than Arizona, isn't it?
Very different, but in a good way. In a good way.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really glad you got to enjoy that. Japan is personally one of my favorite places, and I think I'm not alone in that by far. And hopefully, we've made you a convert as well. Do you hope to get back there? Maybe I don't know if card games count as work. Then would you like to go back for pleasure?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would go back. I mean, the experience was amazing. I think that one of the nice things about Flesh and Blood being a hobby that I pursue is that it gives me an excuse to travel to some places that I ordinarily would be like, can I really take a week off and go do this? But it's nice to say, oh, I'm going to go play this for this game I enjoy. And then I get to explore a little bit, different parts around the world. And so I'm excited to kind of see where the organized play team continues to post events. And, I'll keep my eye out for opportunities to, have more unique travel destinations and whatnot.
Excellent. Is that something that drew you to gaming in general, the travel aspect of it, or was that something that kind of became a fringe benefit as you got deeper and deeper into both video gaming and card gaming?
Funny enough, it kind of was a fringe benefit. I never really played paper card games before. Like I know a lot of people on our team and in the community, like, oh, maybe they played Magic or some
Mhm.
other card games. A lot of my experience has been digital. So it's like, laptop, phone, whatever, you're kind of remote, you can play whenever. You're generally not traveling around the world. So I would say that originally, when I was getting into Flesh and Blood, it was something I wouldn't know if I would like or not. But I've got to say, over the however many years it's been at this point. I have very fond memories on being able to travel, together with friends, go to these events, and have a great time both playing in the events and then being able to explore a lot of the local scenery or whatever else you can do where they're being hosted.
And special shout out to you mentioned some of the local people, and they're not like in Japan, but this deck tech comes as a very special request by a member of Team Blue Pitch who came up to you during our Team Sealed event to say, "When do I get to see the Oscilio deck tech?" So it's
Yeah.
coming at you, my friend.
Yeah, I had a lot of people, surprisingly, more people than I think ever before throughout the event come up and say, like, hey, I'd love to see your deck. I'd love to have you walk me through this. I was like, okay, I'll just put something together with the masterclass expert, Bryce, and we'll make it accessible to everybody. And, people can take that in and use it as they will.
And how exciting to do this, especially after our last deck tech. We basically were talking from the standpoint of, yeah, this is a Kano deck, and we're talking about it because it won a Living Legend tournament, not necessarily because there's anything unique in the Kano deck.
Yeah, I mean, Kano, I think at that point, established deck, people know about it, roughly. Like you might have some flavor picks, things like that, but nothing out of the box. I think Oscilio very interesting in that a lot of people probably had him on the do not play tier,
Mm.
where if you were practicing against Oscilio, you probably had a limited amount of games. I think even people who are big Oscilio enjoyers are very in the experimental phase of deck building. Like I don't think the 80 for Oscilio is solved yet. I don't think even necessarily the playstyles for Oscilio are solved yet. I think that there have been a lot of interesting creations from the community. Myself and Zach Wallach, a big innovator on this deck, kind of coming together to make different takes. And I'm kind of excited to see how the hero develops into the future because I think a lot of people are sleeping on Oscilio. By no means do I think he's like a killer best deck in the format. Like, oh my gosh, he's so busted. But he can definitely win games, and especially if people aren't well practiced into him, you can make a lot of mistakes that you can get punished quite severely for. So.
And is that part of the reason you chose to bring him to Worlds? Because you kind of had the opportunity to skill check any opponents that could be caught unawares?
Yeah, partially. I mean, obviously, at Worlds, you're generally playing against the highest caliber of player. Like, you're expecting the fiercest competition, especially if you're trying to make those deep runs into the tournament. Every game is against a strong player, and you're really trying to squeeze every edge you can. I think that some of the pros I considered in locking in Oscilio were that I thought his matchup spread into what I expected the metagame to be was actually pretty decent. Like, it definitely wouldn't be the deck that had the most weighted equity, but it was competitive, I would say. On top of that, like you mentioned, I think that there was a non zero amount of equity to be gained by just saying, hey, I'm pretty confident that no matter who I sit down across from in any of these rounds, I have more matchup practice on this Oscilio versus whatever you're
Mm.
playing than you do against me. So I think that there is value in that. And in most of my games, I would say that people didn't play the equipment or necessarily the cards in some cases that I would have played if I was playing it from their side. So I think it ended up being true.
Very cool. And so exciting to feel like you have. I mean, our team, and I think pretty much every other TCG team out there is trying to access this kind of thing that you're talking about whenever we go to a
Mm-hmm.
tournament. So how exciting for you to have felt like you had that going into Worlds.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the deck is a ton of fun. Like anybody who's played Acilio, even if you get like totally whooped or whatever, like there's just so many micro decisions. The character is so fun. It's very unique. LSS has taken a very distinctive stance on Wizard. We had Kano, then Icelander, and now Verdance and Acilio, all four play kind of completely differently,
Hmm.
where you're like, well, what is the wizard class trying to do exactly? And their win conditions are slightly different. And, some of them are more defensive than others. Some have more health than others. Some have disruption. Some are like all in aggro. It's very unique that each wizard feels like they have a very distinctive strategy.
Yeah, and so I do want to ask a question real quick. Like, before we get into the nitty gritty about what Oscilio does, do you feel like he's a wizard?
Funny enough, yes, I think he is, but it's kind of interesting that we have, I think this is probably the first wizard. Verdan's probably to a similar extent, but a little bit lesser, where you don't want to play Stormstriders generally. Like, maybe the final perfect 80 of Oscilio is playing Stormstriders. Like, that could exist. I
Hmm.
have tinkered around with Stormstriders and Oscilio, but it feels like the new Lightning Boots are so powerful for the card pool Oscilio has access to that, like, LSS is basically like, yeah, give up these Striders. We know that you like them, you wizard players, but we're going to make you play a different way. I would say that Oscilio is probably closest to Runeblade, but they play in a way that's not quite Runeblade-esque, and
Hmm.
it's still wizard. You have not a lot of armor. Your life is below 40. A lot of your cards don't block very well, which is especially true for Oscilio. So
Hmm.
I think it has that unique kind of slice, but maybe like if you consider the OG wizard to be Kano, we are kind of gearing away from that total glass cannon and maybe towards more of like a we deal split damage, more similar to a Runeblade,
Hmm.
perhaps.
And even though it is a little bit different, it clearly hasn't stopped you from diving in deep, which is cool, right? I think it's awesome that they're accessing the wants and needs of established wizard players while changing the game.
Yeah, yeah. LSS has been doing a great job, I think, in terms of developing new ways to play the game and new identities for heroes to kind of have their own flavor and branch out from maybe whatever the base is.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're enjoying it, Alex. And
Yeah.
without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the nitty gritty that I've been prefacing basically since the beginning of this video. First of all, Alex, what the heck does Acilio do, and why would you choose to take him to a tournament?
Yeah, so I think where I ended up on my take of Oscilio at a high kind of level is I was switchboarding between kind of two main categories of gameplay. So, and we'll touch in some of the details a little bit later, but gameplay strategy one is more of like a mid-range value strategy where you're almost playing for points, but not quite or exclusively. Almost similar to a Rune Blade, like say you play an Aurora Mirror or something like that. You're just trying to extract as much value as possible from each turn. Maybe value blocking, throwing one card fours, two card eights, etc.
Hmm.
And looking for that opportunity to maybe have like one kind of decent or really explosive turn to push you over the top to get to the finish line.
Okay.
I would say the alternative strategy to that, which you would do depending on the matchup, is playing kind of a more all-in combo strategy where you're not really concerned about the points, you're not really concerned about value over each turn cycle. You're really just looking to maybe get a little bit of chip damage throughout the game and then have one really, really big turn that pushes you over where you either win on that turn or you gain so much from that cycle that you're able to kind of close the game out with the tempo you might have achieved or the life gain you might have, or the life lead you might have built or whatever that is. But that's kind of the two identities that my version of the 80 took on the deck.
And since you've just talked about the combo version of the deck, let's go ahead and look at what one of those combos could potentially look like. Shout out to TCG Talk. This is an example of a very powerful combo turn from Acilio, and probably one of the main reasons that most people would think of Acilio as a pick to take to a big tournament. Go ahead and break this down for me, Alex.
Yeah, so like at a high level, right? What is Cilio, when we say combo turn, we're looking for like really big damage outputs that would push over whatever somebody could block. So, when you get to like 30 plus damage in a turn, you're usually doing something that is like really backbreaking for the opponent. And similar to what we were talking about, like leaving Stormstriders for the Lightning Greaves, the real reason you're doing that is primarily to abuse Gone in a Flash, where by playing an instant, in resolution step, you're able to attack with Resolve a Gone in the Flash, then play some instant, which is ideally giving you the value of that card, and giving you the action point from the boots to play that Gone in a Flash again. So it's like having an Endless Arrow, except it's a block 3, 4 attack lightning card, and it doesn't have to be played from your arsenal. It is quite powerful. Now, talking about combo turns in general, usually you would prefer to have some series of lightning cards which allow you to recur Gone in a Flash multiple times, and then ending on some spell that has an on-hit. Like, the only wizard spells you're playing are usually ones that have pretty powerful effects. Think like Etchings, which effectively draws you a card from your deck, which is even better than drawing a card because those sigils have incremental value attached to them. You have Mind Warp, which will strip cards from your opponent, or maybe they were saying a lot of no blocks because they like their hand, and then, well, now they don't get to keep it. You've got some, some thought considerations for the deck, like Destructive Aether Tide or Aether Arc, where you're able to generate value by either destroying a card in their arsenal instead of taking a card from their hand, or drawing a card at the end of your turn. So you really are building towards maybe, 5, 6 chain links of Gone in a Flash into maybe like a Volzar +8, or 6 to 8 on a spell, that you're ending up on for like 7 to 11. And if you're getting to those 30, 40 damage turns, you're generally putting the game state in a spot where you don't have to do too much to close the game out. Or if you've leaked a lot of chip damage, over the course of the game, with a lot of the breakpoints you have being 4 and stuff, they might just die on that turn. So I guess looking at this specific graphic, right, like usually, whether it's in your hand or arsenal, Gone in a Flash is one of those pieces that you really need. Another card that's really potent in this combo is Sigil of Brilliance. And in particular, with the helmet piece that you're usually playing, I think Flash of Brilliance,
That's
it's
correct.
called.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, this might be a card that you think, oh, if you've only played Oscilio on draft, it's like, oh, you gain 1 life. Like, there's not really that much effect. But in a constructed Oscilio deck, the way that you can morph your hands with this card, and particularly abuse Sigil of Brilliance, is something that you really, like, this card is so close in power level, in my opinion, to Traverse the Universe. And it doesn't seem that way at all. But think about, I draw my hand up. I had a Sigil of Brilliance in play. Like maybe I drew a combo hand, but it's like missing a card. Or maybe I drew like an extra lightning attack that I didn't need, like Channel Lightning Valley, or not Channel Lightning Valley, it's, what is it, Current Funnel, or like Lightning Surge, or Flittering Charge or something, and you're like, well, this card doesn't do anything special over Gone in a Flash. Like, if this was any instant or something, it would be better on my combo turn. Well, you can discard those cards to bounce your Sigil, which the Sigil itself is an instant, which is perfect for your combo turn. And then on top of that, you draw an extra card, and that extra card could be extremely impactful on your turn. Say you draw another great instant. I mean, you just turned your helmet into a block 1, which gained your life, and then you discarded your card to add, say, your Sigil of Brilliance to your hand, which gains you 4 damage from, say, Gone to a Flash. Plus, when you play the Sigil, it's going to convert into a card on the next cycle, and then maybe that extra card you draw from it leaving the play could be worth another 4 or 5 points, depending on if you're using Volzar or not. So there's really some really powerful things you can do, and that interaction can help you set up like 6-card hands. And if you're going into your combo turn undisrupted with a 6-card hand, and your hand like actually functions, you can very easily do 30, 40 damage and break the game wide open.
And so since you mentioned it, let's go ahead and get into the deck, shall we? Especially because it's important to note that this particular sorry, I'm going to point this way. This particular infographic does include a card that you have elected to omit from your list. So let's start talking about, this is why people might be interested in playing Oscilio. Let's talk about your own personal take on it, shall we? And first of all, let's go ahead and start with the hero himself. You talked about the power of filtering with Sigil of Brilliance and Flash of Brilliance, but Oscilio kind of just has a filtration mechanic built into him. How impactful is that in this hero, and how much does it play into his game plan?
Yeah, so the way I have taken on Oscilio, you're not really a deck that's playing for fatigue, right? If you're playing against a deck that's trying to fatigue you, your goal is to just set up a combo turn that will push you over the top. So decking out is not really a concern. So even though the hero ability of being able to discard an instant to draw a card might seem a little like nonchalant, it's surprisingly quite powerful. If you think about, in the past, people have talked about like Dash Inventor Extraordinaire. They get to start with an item in play from their deck. So they're only playing a 59 card deck. The ability to delete cards from your deck and replace them effectively shortens your deck size, which means you're going to see the cards you want faster. You have more filtration options. It means the density of power within your deck is going to be higher. And so the ability of Oscilio to discard and maybe look for specific pieces when you don't want, say, a card in your hand is extremely powerful. And this is probably the first hero that LSS has printed that allows you to really play some fun tech cards. Like a lot of tech cards that have existed in Flesh and Blood history, well, not a lot of them, but there are tech cards that are like instant no blocks. And any deck who wants to play these, who plays a normal game of Flesh and Blood, you're like, wow, this is such a liability. Like if I draw this tech card, think like Poison the Well, probably something that's being discussed a lot given the success of Count Your Blessings. But, there's cards like Poison the Well, think Rewinds. Like, there was times when I was playing Icelander Kano, it's like, man, Wizard's really popular, Rewind's great, but like, do I want a Bricking Kano? Do I want a blue that like I don't really want to put in Arsenal as Icelander, etc.? If you draw these tech cards as Oscilio, you can just discard and filter them. And yeah, Snag is another great example. Like the opportunity cost of playing these cards is so low that in the matchups you're playing them where you can gain an edge, if you draw it at the right time, you're like, well, perfect. I'll leverage this. I'll get the full value, which is the entire reason you're playing the tech card. But let's say you have full tempo, your opponent doesn't present a spot for you. You can just replace it with any other card from your deck. Like, I'm not sure if you watched the finals game at the World Championship, but, one of the impactful turns I thought was when the Aurora player drew a Poison the Wells on like their really big go turn, and they ended up losing a lot of damage because they kind of drew a brick when they needed to continue like pushing the gas pedal. And like for Oscilio, like let's say your combo turn happens and you have one of these cards in your deck and you draw it. Well, number one, they're instant, so you can just turn them into a Ganon Flash, which is perfectly fine. But if you want to turn it into something else, or maybe you had an opt or it's on top, you can turn this into any other card in your deck, which is really powerful because it reduces the downside of having tech cards be useless or below rate in your hands, as you can swap them out kind of more liberally than any other hero.
Yeah, that's always the conundrum with tech cards, isn't it? It's like, well, great, I have this one of, in this case, Poison the Well in my deck for Count Your Blessings, but if it is one, in my hand when I don't want it to be, or two, not in my hand when it needs to be, then what the heck was the point of running that card?
Exactly.
So, in the other thing to mention is that Oscilio's card pool kind of just allows you to take advantage of this filtering ability quite a bit. And the main one that I want to talk about in that regard is Comet Storm Shock. Normally, you want to be casting the non-attack side of this card, but because it's got instant on the other side, you can still discard it if it's bricking your hand.
Sure can. I mean, Comet Storm Shock is one of those interesting cards in Oscilio because it doesn't do anything particularly crazy. Like, you look at this card and, like, it does some cool things. It can be powerful in specific spots. A lot of the times it can just be a block 3, or like you said, you can discard it to filter. But what makes this card particularly potent is how flexible it is. It's a lightning card. It blocks 3. You can discard it if you need to. Sometimes Shock is the best card you can play in a spot, like it'll just win you a game. And then, you have the opportunity to send a really big arcane spell if you have a lot of room, a lot of pitch. Maybe they don't have a lot of AB. So it's just the flexibility of this card is so powerful that even though the card by itself might not be good, it just helps the consistency and fluidity of the deck overall.
Indeed. So we're meandering a bit, and I want us to do that. I enjoy meandering, especially with you, Alex. But let's go ahead and go over some of the more generic parts of this deck, right? Let's talk about the weapon, because that is a critical part of that pop-off turn, and I don't think any Oscilio worth their salt is running anything but his signature weapon.
Yeah, I mean, this weapon is very explosive. You see it in draft and you see it in CC. It's like, if you can get Volzar up to like 4 or higher, you're getting game-breaking math. Like, your 0 for 4 lightning cards, assuming you can leverage this amp, are 0 for 5, which is like insanely above rate. All the sigils you're playing to do things, they're increasing that as well. And the real critical thing here is that the amp allows you to turn your arcane damage into hits that are converting, right? So we talked about like a lot of the actual actions we're playing for arcane spells are spells that when they surge or when they hit, they do some special effect that is usually highly beneficial to you. And, if you're able to, say, amp that over the value of their AB and guarantee that's going to hit, that's very powerful. But even if you're not going to amp it over the AB, say you get like an extra 2 points here or there, you still force them to give you cards. And if they don't give you cards, you're still just pushing that extra damage. You're converting value. It kind of goes back to those strategies we were talking about where, well, I'm playing a mid-range strategy. Like, how do I squeeze out as many points as possible? Volzar, being able to convert your lightning turns and ending with value from Volzar is critical in those mid-range matchups. And then on those combo turns where you might be going like 10 chain links wide, if you can amp the Volzar for like 6 or 7, like you're doing game-breaking math on your really big turns.
And at a certain point, your arcane spells are getting over the hump of your opponent's AB. Even if they are going super hard in AB, the max they can do is like 4 or 5. So
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of turns with Volzar where you get over that. And so you enter this realm of unblockable damage, which is really sweet, especially when you are forcing your opponents to run armor because you're also throwing Gone in the Flash 16 times.
Yeah, it's a very interesting deck building situation against Oscilio, and it's very hard, I think, to identify how you should play into him. Because unlike, say, Kano, Oscilio is probably mostly physical damage. Like a lot of what he's doing is physical damage, but
Mhm.
ideally he's sprinkling in that arcane. And so it's hard because you really need kind of both. You want some AB, but you also really want some armor you can leverage. I think Runeblade is in a particularly nice spot against Oscilio just because of how strong the Carapace is. It's very easy for them to be at AB3 and also have a reasonable amount of block. Whereas I think most other heroes in the game have a really hard decision to make. It's like, well, if I'm playing Dash IO, should I play Visitronic into Oscilio or should I play like Crown of Providence or, something like Balance of Justice, something like that? It's like, do I value the armor block or do I value maybe the ability to pitch more to AB if I want? So you kind of ask some really hard questions. And similar to the flexibility of the game plans of a lot of wizards, you can really decide as the Oscilio player how you want to play a particular game depending on how people flipped up their equipment. Like, say they flip up no armor, a bunch of AB and spell void. You're like, well, perfect. I just won't prioritize throwing spells at you. They block 3, I'll block 3, and I'll throw a bunch of attacks at you, and you're probably eating them. Or if you're blocking them in the aggro matchup, you're giving me more tempo. So you can really kind of exploit how your opponents might sideboard into you, and you ask some really hard questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the rest of the equipment suite, shall we,
Mm-hmm.
Alex? You have already mentioned Flash of Brilliance. This is a common
Yeah.
that is a mainstay in draft, but it's a common that is a banger in this CC deck. Tell us why.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but like I compare this card, it's not quite as strong, but it is very similar in power level to Traverse the Universe. And Traverse the Universe is probably one of the best, it probably is the best headpiece that's ever been printed in Flesh and Blood. So that should give you an idea for how powerful this is. Zach has always joked that LSS put brilliance in this card's name to teach us what to do with it. Because that interaction of discarding it to return Sigil of Brilliance to your hand is probably what you want to be doing most of the time. However, there are plenty of spots you can leverage this for other uses that are totally acceptable or might give you that hand or that card you need to fix whatever it is you're doing. Maybe you need the embodiment of lightning or whatever it might be. It's just, it goes back to the decision trees of Oscilio. Like this card just feeds into that strategy even more where you have more micro decisions, more things to decide. It allows you to kind of sculpt your hands along with the hero power and filtration and whatnot to get the cards you need to accomplish what you're planning to do.
So at this point, Alex, I want to turn to Aether Bindings of the Third Age, which, even though it doesn't say it on it, by all intents and purposes, is probably just an Oscilio specialization at this point. I don't think there's a single wizard in any other class or any other specialization that is going to be running these gloves.
Yeah, I mean, Aether Bindings is a very interesting card, especially as the pool expands. Like, Acilio is one of those decks where if you give them even one more sigil that's competitively viable, it could change the deck a lot. Snowballs with this card even more. One thing I always like to consider about the Wizard glove slot is that traditionally it's been lower power level relative to your other pieces, right? Like most decks over the course of Fab history usually opt to play Metacarpus nodes for like, oh, I can pay some pumps here, maybe have a little bit more burst, build onto a Kano combo, etc. You've had some wizards, maybe more of the defensive style, that might even opt to just play straight up iron rot gloves, right? Or gauntlets, the ones that you pay 1 for 2. So it is fun to see a legendary slot finally hit the kind of wizard glove slot. And in terms of just the value that this provides, it's something that really does a lot of consistency buffing for the deck overall. I think usually it's pretty easy to get 3 points of value from this card via, the block one with Battle Worn, and then ideally you should be able to get at least 2 sigils. Sometimes you might do better than that, but I consider 2 the baseline of, okay, I got 3 value from this glove slot. That's pretty good compared to, the alternative being Iron Rod or Iron Knight or something like that. It helps you uh, push some of your surge effects through, right? So it could be the difference maker in, Mind Warp hitting or something to that effect, which is very critical. And, if you just happen to have that turn with a bunch of sigils, you could just crack this for, 4 or 5 damage just to push that kind of arcane threshold over. So it's definitely a card that I think is already powerful. But, if we see some more sigils coming, particularly kind of like how you mentioned outside of Oscilio, this card could shape up to be, one of those legendary staples that exists for certain class pools.
Alex, I'm thinking back to probably like 50 to 75% of the Kano games I've played with the Kano in the opponent's slot, and half the time they don't even pop Metacarpus nodes. So like the fact that you have something you can use almost every single game does seem pretty significant.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Kano in particular is nice because if you have the extra resources, you can pump it into that. Like, well, here's my turn. They die, or things get weird. Whereas a lot of the other wizards that aren't quite as all in can really benefit from that flexibility of like, okay, like I could stop an on hit of 4 with like a block 3 plus this, which is nice. It gives you another breakpoint cover. And then on top of that, you can also use it offensively. So it's not, it's a big upgrade from, you know, Iron Rot Gauntlets, which is something that, like Icelander played for a reasonable chunk of the time that she was one of the best decks in the format, right? And, you know, look at some of the strong heroes or classes like Brute and Runeblade, right? They've got all these big pieces of equipment. They all do something very impactful for the deck. It's very strong. A class like Wizard has always kind of like filled in pieces. And like, I'm not saying that they don't have cool things, but it's very different from these very premium armor sets that exist for some of the other classes. So Aether Bindings is nice that it's kind of expanding into a slot that I think has traditionally been one of the more undervalued slots in the Wizard pool.
Spellfire Cloak, Ragamuffin's Hat, two commons that kind of prove your point.
Exactly, exactly.
Moving on, we've been talking a lot about the big combo turn that Oscilio is
Mm-hmm.
building towards. And this is the card that makes it happen. This is Lightning Greaves. Talk to me, Alex.
Yeah, yeah. Lightning Greaves is the bread and butter of what it seems like a lot of Acilio decks are wanting to do with Gone in a Flash, right? Like without the Lightning Greaves, you can't do those big, massive turns with Gone in a Flash. And, the ability to convert maybe 3, 4 action points with effectively a lightning endless arrow is probably one of the great appeals for Acilio currently. I think it's like this is what the deck is doing that's inherently strong. We would prefer to do this every game if we could. And if we can, we're gaining so much value from it that we're hopefully able to either win the game on that cycle or win enough tempo or control of the game that we're able to close from kind of that post, let's call it combo state. Um, it's interesting because I think for the longest time, most wizards are like, oh, auto include Stormstriders. Like, no thought. It's super good. We love to do that. And I think Stormstriders is an interesting card in Acilio because you can kind of do a little bit more of the arcane burst. Whereas, with Lightning Greaves, you're really kind of limited to the effect of what your shocks can do. So I tried it a little bit, but I think the way that this card particularly interacts with Gone in a Flash is just so fundamentally powerful that you really have to make a tough sell to consider Stormstriders. So I think it's cool that LSS is presenting alternatives, to, oh, every wizard's always going to play Stormstriders because you get that extra turn, you get that extra burn, whatever, to give some creative options for, well, wizards don't have to be defined around Stormstriders, right?
Which is interesting. When you heard that two new wizards were coming in Rosetta, was that kind of your mindset? Did you think they were going to be completely different? Um, I mean, some of these legendary equipment almost like feed into a hero's text a little bit, right? I mean, like even though Oscilio says instant discard an or instant discard an instant draw a card, it's almost like these lightning greaves and the aether bindings are built into his hero text. Like to understand the hero is not just to read the hero; it's to understand their equipment. Did you think that they were going to they being LSS were going to deviate away from that really rigid understanding of wizard that we've had up until this point?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a ton of expectations. Like when they were originally spoiling some of the cards, like I think one of the first cards we saw from the set was like Pulse of Candlehold, right? The
Mm,
Verdance, heal one, heal one, heal one. And I was like, wow, that is very unwizard like. Like, what does that mean? What does the future hold for some of these design philosophies? The end result, I think, has been extremely interesting. We touched on it a bit where Acilio plays similar to a Runeblade, and Verdance kind of plays similar to like a Guardian. Um, and it's interesting to see, I guess, the four CC viable wizards that have been created, in the span of the game to have kind of unique flavors. You've had one for each of the elements, right? And then you've had the Kano from way back in the day, who was kind of built to be that all-in aggro deck. And I think it's fun to see class identities diverge into kind of unique axes, right?
mm,
Like, you look at Brute, and I think that Brute is actually probably one of the other classes that does a really good job of kind of splitting. Like, you have Leviathan, which really plays into this whole like banish, blood debt, managing resources. I have this way I can flip my hero into a demi hero and do all these other cool effects. You've got like Reinar, which, while historically has been maybe a little underrepresented, underfavored, things like that. The intimidate mechanic, removing cards from your hand that you might want to block with. Then you got like KO, like this consistent, like, oh, I'm just going to send it every turn. I'm always going to hit. It's pure number of value race. So like, I think it is good for each hero to have their own kind of like, well, this is the direction I'm going to take the class, and you might have some cards in that pool that kind of diverge off into there, and it's very creative to see LSS kind of not be afraid to explore alternative ways for these heroes to kind of take the class instead of just printing one that's like straight up better than another, right?
mm-hmm.
Like, oh, we're going to take Kano and we're going to give him elements, right? Something like that.
Yeah, looking at you, Ninja. Let's move on. Let's go ahead and go to the chess slot, Alex. And this is one that could be a little bit contentious. I know the people that have been toying with Oscilio since his release are either on the Fiendal Spring Tunic train or the Blossom of Spring train, or maybe not being able to decide and including one in the sideboard. It seems like the question that you want to answer is, do I want to try to get extra resources and 1 point of block value, or do I just never want to have to miss an opportunity when my combo turn comes around? Seems like you've locked in solely on Fiendal Spring Tunic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, deck slots are tight. They ask you a very hard deck building challenge to fit within 80 cards, the 60 cards you want into every matchup. Very, very challenging endeavor. And I think that regardless of which chess piece you play, if you happen to draw a hand where you're like, wow, this is a great combo hand. If you're playing Tunic and it's not up, like, that sucks. You would prefer to have that resource, which is the flexibility that Blossom of Spring gives you, is that if you happen to draw it before your Tunic would be on 3, you have the ability to just go right then, which is nice. I think, though, with kind of the strategy that I was employing with this deck overall, with kind of those two macro level concepts of, are we playing like a combo deck where we're expecting the game to go long, we're trying to set up for that one really big turn, or are we trying playing more mid-rangey where we're trying to value block, maybe stop some of these on hits from the aggro decks, etc., and then find at least a decent combo turn to either pivot it in our favor or close the game out. And I think with the way I was playing, in particular being a little bit more defensive into a lot of the aggro decks, I think like Dio, Aurora, um, when you're doing that kind of blocking strategy, you're kind of incentivizing yourself to go longer into the game. Like instead of playing like, hey, let's play 2, 3 turns and the game's over. It's like, oh, we might go 6, 7 turns and kind of grind it out a bit. And you're probably less likely to get multiple tunic counters in one of those aggro matchups. But the ability to gain 1 life is nice because it bumps you up from what would be 39 health with armor to 40. So you are kind of a full health hero, which is nice. Not many wizards can say that. So just in the optimization of that deck building, I opted to cut the Blossom because I thought the risk of not having the resource when I wanted it was lower than just having the extra deck slot to build a stronger AD.
And let's talk about the value proposition of what you can do with this tunic counter when it's not the combo turn. Because on the flip side, we also have the opportunity, perhaps the issue where you have this tunic resource sitting around for a while and nothing to do with it because you're just not seeing the combo. Tell me some of the more useful things you've been able to do with tunic when it's not the combo turn.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the combo just doesn't come, or the way that the game goes and how life is traded, you're just not going to have the space to do a full combo turn. And so, in those situations, your discipline to hold the tunic is like, well, I'm not going to get that combo turn. What's the most value I can get from it? Some lower value plays that these do happen from time to time. You might have a really nice wide lightning turn, but just not have a sigil or not have like a conductivity
Hmm.
permanent in play. And so you don't really want to pitch an entire card, especially if that card's like a 0 for 4 lightning card to amp. So like Tunic can be okay in those spots. I think personally, where I have found the most value for this card outside of combo turns is with Eclectic Magnetism. Let's say that you need to pitch your one to play Magnetism, and you're going to follow it up with one of the 0 damage arcane spells,
Hmm.
Mind Warp, Etchings, Destructive Aethertide, and you have sigils, or maybe you started with like a Lightning Search from Arsenal before this, or you had Dogen with Flittering Charge into Electromagnetic, into Eclectic, into so like I think where you see the value from Tunic is where Tunic allows you to convert an extra card from your hand into resolving it, opposed to pitching or maybe blocking with it, right? So Magnetism probably the one that comes up for if you weren't getting it on a combo turn, I probably could see you getting a lot of value with it on a strong eclectic turn. You know, so.
Excellent. At this point, I want to turn to the sideboard, Alex, because there are two more pieces of equipment that we haven't talked about yet.
Mhm.
And there are only two in your sideboard for which you can switch out. The first one, however, is one that you'd swap out for this card, Flash of Brilliance, that you've said is pretty much on par with Traverse the Universe. And yet you have a replacement for it. And this is Balance of Justice. Tell me why.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Brilliant's very powerful. We talked about it being kind of the glue that can hold some of these turns together, increase your consistency, like allow you to say, oh, my hand is like 1 card off, or I really needed to not draw another lightning attack. That filtering is so powerful. The matchup that you really play Balance of Justice into, where it kind of beats that value proposition, was Dio, right? Dio's so explosive with her turns, very easily able to draw, 2 cards in a single turn. Obviously, pre high octane ban, right? That with Cerebellum Processor, Spark of Genius, etc. It was almost always a draw an extra card, which whenever you're getting that effect, it feels great. And then the other thing that was really key in that matchup is just the boom grenades, right? Like when Dio's racing somebody, Oscilio included, um, how many boom grenades hit you is very relevant in who's able to kind of close the game or get to the finish line first. And so having that little extra bit of armor, I know, between Brilliance and this, it's 1, but you'd be surprised, cover a twin drive, cover something with a 2 block
Yep.
that's 4, etc. It gives you that extra survivability, which is really important. Like there are some alternative matchups that you could consider bringing this in, like against Brutes, because they still have Blood Rush Bellow. Um, you have some niche interaction with Mind Warp because, if you hit them and they have, I guess, at least 3 cards, they'll redraw at least 2 cards. If you
Oh, I hadn't even
Surge,
thought of that. That's fun.
yeah. So, you get a
That's
Ponder,
fun.
probably not the best use, but like, hey, headpiece that says block 2, draw a card, pretty good. That main value proposition though is probably Dio. And that's the main reason I included it during Worlds.
So you mentioned the high octane ban for
Hmm.
Dio. Now that we've seen that come down the pipeline, Are you thinking that this remains in the 80 for a tournament that, say, happens like tomorrow?
Um, I think it depends on what your expectation is around Dio. Uh, Dio definitely got a big kind of tone down. You could do some really degenerate things with high octane, and the deck I think is still quite powerful. If you're playing this card against Dio, you're probably still proccing it. But the question you got to ask yourself is, well, what percentage of the meta is Dio going to actually hold moving forward? And does this slot kind of justify its way into the 80, depending on what your answer is to that question? And I think it's a little too early to say. I think the Dio's still strong. She's definitely not going to be probably as prevalent as she was pre BNR. But I would not include this card if it was only for brutes and like Mind Warp mini
Mm,
equity. Like this card was primarily in the list for Dio, and I don't see any other decks that are rising into the future metagame. Like I don't think Jarl's gonna have impact on Balance of Justice. I don't
of
think Aya's gonna
course.
have impact on Balance of Justice. So it's like if it was in there for Dio, the feasibility of this card staying in the deck is probably going to be built around the feasibility of Dio. Like if we decide, oh, Dio's going to fade into nothingness or she's going to be a small piece of the meta, you might have to swap this for a different sideboard card that might give you more equity into a matchup that's going to be a larger slice of that pie. So we'll have to see how it shapes up. Definitely not a card that, you have to have this. I think it was mainly for that Dio matchup.
Moving on to the other surprise you have in your arsenal, and maybe it's not that much of a surprise to our viewers, but this is Shock Charmers. Is this an entire sideboard card that's devoted to Kano, or is there another use case that I'm not thinking of?
Yeah, so Shock Charmers definitely gives you a lot of equity into Kano. We talked about not playing the Null Rune Hood in favor of more equity in other matchups where we would probably only play and use the Hood against specifically Kano. By having Shock Charmers, you have some equity to, stop some of that exponential damage, which is nice. You also get some equity in the mirror with this card. Like I actually prefer to play this over the
Mm,
bindings in the Oscilio mirror, usually because it's very tempo driven and the on hits from the arcane spells are usually quite potent. Like you don't really want to be getting searched on in the mirror just because of all the search cards you're playing have powerful on hit effects. You're not playing weak search cards. And so if you're able to turn off like a Mind Warp with this, or an Aether Tide or an Etchings or whatever it might be, you're denying almost a whole extra card's worth of value, usually by stopping that surge effect. And so, that ability to kind of just block two without having to pay anything can be really pivotal in the mirror if you're trading back and forth and it lets you keep that card or it stops an on hit effect or whatever it might be. So those are the two matchups I played in, both not large slices of the metagame. So I mean, if you really wanted to be greedy on your 80 and side for different pieces, you could probably trim this, but I brought it just to be safe.
have you found an instance where you activate the ability of this card in testing?
So it can come up, although I think it's particularly rare. Oscilio is one of those like pitch perfect decks. Like I want as
Hmm.
few cards in my pitch zone over the course of the game as I can muster. Like you might pitch a blue here and there to maybe do like a magnetism into a 2 cost, or like maybe you're sending in a more expensive card. But usually your best Oscilio turns are I pitch no cards. Here's a bunch of zeros, maybe a sigil into a 0 cost amp spell, something like that.
Sure.
Um, so I think that there are situations where it might arise, and you're like, oh, well, like they said no blocks here, and I don't think they're playing D-React. So if I just pay two here, they have to kill me or die. So like those kind of situations can arise, although you're primarily playing this for the 12 void too.
Makes sense. At this point, Alex, it is important to mention to our viewers that if if you say something about the Oscilio meta, or excuse me, not the Oscilio meta, the Oscilio mirror, it's important to take you seriously because there were countless nights leading up to Worlds where I saw you and our current players champion at the AGE Open Series, Zachary Wallach, just hammering games into each other, Oscilio mirrors all night. And so it's important to mention also at this point that Zach is kind of a co-author of this deck and was probably the chief officer of your who encouraged you to take this deck to Worlds.
Yeah, no, me and Zach really kind of built something special for Worlds. I'm really proud of how we were able to kind of collaborate on bringing this together. He definitely inspired me to give the deck a spin.
Mm.
And after giving it a spin, I was like, I could see something here. And so, yeah, he was kind of that little, on the shoulder, like talking to you, like, do it, play Oscilio. And, we had a lot of fun building this. He played a huge role in that.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you both enjoyed that. It's always nice to see collaborations on the AGE Pro team, especially successful ones. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the main body of the deck here, Alex. We've already mentioned, I believe that there are a couple of interesting omissions here. Number one is Blast to Oblivion, which can maybe turn the Aether Bindings of the Third Age into a guaranteed 3 value, into sometimes a little bit more on the combo turn. We're also missing Fry, which maybe is kind of phased out, but was a mainstay in Oscilio decks, at least at Rosetta's outset. So talk to me about your overall philosophy when putting together this 80.
Yeah, so you have some really tough questions, especially preparing for a tournament like Worlds, where no matter what tournament I'm prepping for, I think the most important question you need to ask yourself when building is within my 80, do I have 60 cards that I'm comfortable with into at least all the primary matchups I'm expecting? You don't want to have to say, oh, I'm playing filler cards into this deck that I think's 8% of the field, call it, Azalea or whatever the card might be. You want to make sure that, into the lion's share of the meta you're expecting, that you're like, I have a rock solid 60 into all these. Like I do some little tweaking here and there. I've got several cards that come in and out depending on the matchup. It's very important to me in deck building to have ratios where you have that fine-tuned 60 into most of the metagame. Now, good luck having the perfect 60 into every deck that exists. Probably impossible, but like, this is where you talk about, well, did I really want to play that Null Rune Hood for the 1% Kano?
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, I wanted to play this snag for the 10% new or whatever, right? So you run into a lot of interesting questions. I tested a lot of cards. You brought up Fry, Blast to Oblivion as one of the few cards besides Gone in a Flash that you could build a combo turnaround. Like you can do some really disgusting things with Gone in a Flash. But in combining my deck to get to the best 60 possible for every matchup, I ended up excluding some of these cards. Like, I considered Snatch, E-Strike, some of these other cards that are reasonable and they do things in certain matchups. But just the way it lined up, I think the one card I have that probably competes with Blast the most is probably Lightning Surge, a card that people
Mm-hmm.
may or may not be including. And I just found this card to be so pivotal in like post combo states, and even in like non-combo turns, like pre-combo, just as like a bread and butter, 0 for 4 lightning, we love that. Conditional go again, we love that,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of gives you that value proposition on those turns that you might not be able to break boots. Like one of the topics that's very critical to touch on in these Oscilio decks is like to really be successful and win these games, like, yeah, you would like a strong combo turn. But if the rest of your turns over the course of the game sucked, you're not winning, generally speaking, unless you have like the nuttiest combo turn ever. And so being able to convert like 1, 2, 3, 4, card hands that might come in variable shapes and sizes, I think is very important for the Oscilio identity. And, Lightning Surge being one of those cards that kind of like glues your deck together. If you're able to use Volzar, you're getting 5 points from it. It turns on Current Funnel. It turns on a lot of your other effects that need specific things to start before it. It's just one of those cards that I opted for consistency.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You bring up such an important point. It can't just be the combo turn, because usually you're talking around like 30-ish points of value. That's not your opponent's life total the majority of the time in this game. Can you
Yeah,
tell
yeah.
me anything else about the general philosophy of this deck?
Yeah, and so I think to boil it down to kind of macro design philosophy on this deck that was brought, um, in playing in line with like how do I get the best 60 into these matchups, there are really like two divergent paths roughly that I went down. And I classify those, I guess, as like mid-range, which you typically playing against the more aggressive decks.
Mm-hmm.
And then combo, which you're playing against the decks that maybe are a little more defensive, might try to fatigue you. You might need that little extra oomph where you're using life more liberally than you would against the aggro matchups. And I think a lot of these deck building choices were very critical into making sure I had the right 60 kind of subcategory in either of those, depending on which hero I was particularly playing against.
Okay, and since you mentioned it, Alex, you've done an amazing thing for us. You have broken both of these archetypes down for us. Let's go first into the full combo matchup, and let's scroll down. I think the most important way to talk about these two divergent paths that you've set up for us is to first scroll all the way to the bottom and see the cards that you've left out of this particular 60. So when we're in the combo, tell me about the cards that aren't making the list most of the time.
Yeah, yeah. And like these blueprints, let's call them, are kind of like rough guidelines for most of the cards in this core are probably cards you want to be playing. How do we want to like pick and choose these sideboard pieces as we're trying to get to that optimal 60? So one of the things we mentioned against combo opponents where you'd want these strong combo turns is that your life is a resource. Like
Mm,
decks that come to mind in the metagame would have been like Enigma, that you're more concerned with killing their ward and actually killing them. Maybe needing stronger turns if they might be on like a fatigue CYB-esque build. Florian, some of these other mid-range decks that are maybe totally comfortable to block you and try to close the game out. You think like some of your assassins like New might try to like deck you out potentially or outvalue you, or they're on CYB as well. And so some of the cards that really lose their value when you want life to be a resource are the DPX. Like if we're saying our life is a liberal resource and we're just trying to trade as effectively as possible, usually adding more blocking value to gain more points defensively is not generally what you want to be doing. Whereas cards that are no blocks, which might be more of a liability in the aggro matchups where you might need to stop on hits more consistently, allow you to kind of be more flexible with some of the strategies you employ. So like Null Shock is a great example of a card that you can include in matchups where maybe the null side is active. Think like decks that play Chi, Enigma,
mm.
Zen, etc. You might be able to like null an Oasis or something if you get really, it lines up, or maybe an instant or Sigil of Solace or something like that. But really, when you're playing this card, I think you're playing this card because it's the best shock card that you have access to. It's a one cost lightning shock in yellow, which is like the difference between 1 and 2, very big. Like if you're just playing Constorm for the shock side, you would probably prefer not to do that. However, like if it wins you the game, like that's great. And I think that the ability to have these instant shocks is really important for Oscilio to be able to close some of the games you play. Like we talked earlier about how we have kind of transitioned, I think, most Oscilio builds to you're mostly physical, you kind of sprinkle in some arcane, built around these like turns where you're trying to abuse Gone in a Flash with your Lightning Greaves, which means you don't have Storm Striders. So you don't have maybe, say, the typical reach you would expect from like Icelander. She's like, oh, I'll kill you from like 11 to 13. But being able to shock somebody, maybe on their turn when they're tapped out or only have one resource or something like that, like you're in a low HP trade-off and you can tend to shock for like 4 or 5. Like you can just win games. And so
Mm.
you get some really valuable interactions there. And you'd also be surprised how nice it is to have arcane damage at instant speed on your turn. Like there are some funky things you can do with, you know, using your last action point on, say, a Gun in a Flash, and being able in resolution to use the shock to bounce it where, otherwise to play like a Mind Warp or an Aethertide or something, you
Yeah.
would need to forego that last Gone in a Flash hit to do it so that you would have the action point, or you would need to give it go again somehow. So there's some really cool interactions. Being able to do arcane damage on at instant speed, very powerful. And the fact that these are lightning cards, even more powerful, because like you can almost think of it as it's 2 damage on all these shocks since they turn on your Volzar. And ideally, you're using your Volzar if you're doing something like this. It makes me hope that we get a zero cost shock at some point. I think it would be very fun to have in the Oscilio deck list.
I I think at his outset, some of the local Oscilio players I was playing every week once they started including Null Shock in their list, they were so high on a zero cost shock. They were just like, if Oscilio ever gets that, he's overpowered. It's all over. Oscilio is the meta.
It doesn't even have to be a meld card. It could be a no block red, zero shock one.
Dang.
It would probably be good enough. Now, like, that's a little low power level, but like I think it would probably make the cut. I'll be honest.
And hey, if it's ever not the right thing, you can always discard it to Oscilio too, right?
Exactly. And that's what's really nice about a lot of these instant no block tech cards. If it just doesn't line up, discard it, turn it into something else, do it on their turn. If you still don't like what you have, do it on your turn, You get a lot of flexibility, don't be afraid to use that text liberally.
Cool. So you have, let's talk about the bread and butter of the list, Alex. We talked firstly about how you don't have Blast to Oblivion in this list, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a very essential card to Oscilio, but you do have something that I think is a little more interesting, and that's Eclectic Magnetism. Talk to me about this card.
This card I find to be extremely powerful. We touched on it a little bit. We all know that Oscilio can have that one really powerful turn, but if every other turn throughout the game is so subpar, that one turn is not going to eke out the value that you lost over the game. So it's very important that you can still have powerful turns without breaking your boots. And this is one of the cards that can really enable that. Generally, if you're playing Magnetism, it's because you do have a, non-attack you want to play as an instant. So it's a 1 for 6, assuming you're turning on Volzar. And there are a lot of interesting interactions that you can play, like, it slots in nicely with your 2-cost spells like Comet Storm or Spindle if you're just playing for value. Maybe you have a really wide turn against a deck with a lot of lightning cards and you end on like a Mind Warp on top of this. It just allows you to convert hands better. With an embodiment, you could even throw more chain links in there, more attack actions and in on that spell. Like just trying to ask hard questions, trying to, convert 12 plus damage hands on your non-combo turns. So quite a powerful card. I think that you bring up Blast to Oblivion, which is definitely a card I played around a lot with. It ended up just barely not being in my final 80, primarily because of the strategy I was identifying against how I wanted to play in my combo and min-range package, where I didn't think I actually needed it to win my combo games. Like I was not having issues not getting fatigued against those decks. And I didn't think it was consistent enough against mid-range versus some of the alternatives. Like some cards I considered in a similar spot that didn't make the list, like E-Strike, Snatch even, I thought had some potential. I ended up including Lightning Surge, which is maybe a card that teeters in and out depending on who you ask. I like this card in particular because it really helps you on those non-combo turns or even post-combo with being able to apply enough pressure. Like from Arsenal, in theory, this is 0 for 5. Now, similar to most of these attack actions, you don't actually want to see them on your big combo turn. But when it's not your big combo turn, 0 for 4 is good. That's cookie cutter, good flesh and blood math. And assuming you can convert the Volzar on these lightning 0 for 4s that, this one has conditional go again, but cards like Entwine Lightning, which might not be lightning cards themselves, but that can have pseudo unconditional go again, allow you to kind of leverage, well, how do I extract those above average value turns when I'm not breaking boots? And the 0 for 4s are very critical in that. Being able to have a starter from your arsenal, very critical. You could go Lightning Surge into Current Funnel, into Gone and Flash, play a Sigil. Now you just set up your turn, you threw 10 damage. Maybe you even have a spell in there because your Gone and Flash would have go again from Current Funnel. So you play your Sigil, it's free Mind Warp, that's amp 4. I just pushed an on-hit through, set up a combo turn with Sigil Brilliance, took a card from you. Like, there's a lot of powerful interactions you can have. And I think that one thing to note is that while your Oscilio combo can kill somebody, you usually have to play a post combo.
Right.
They might be on like, sub 6 HP or something like that, but you still need to finish the game. And this is a card that I think overperformed a lot in those kind of game states and really helped me in kind of closing that.
I would imagine that in that post combo game, you kind of just want as many of these cards that say 4 on them as possible, right?
4 is a good number. Like a lot of my Aurora games kind of boiled down to we're both like sub 5. 4-4, 4-4,
Mm-hmm.
4-4, like I block three, they block three, block three. And those game states also highlight what we were just talking about with how powerful the shock cards can be. Even Comet Storm, like paying 2 for shock is not great, but if it wins you the game, it doesn't matter, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like if you're playing these 2-card hands, it's not like they can IP the 4. If they're going to send 4-4 into you and you're going to send 4-4 into them, if they tap out and you just have it, you can end the game with these shocks. And being able to create the room to win the game like that is reliant on you being able to convert small card hands for above rate value in post combo game states.
Somebody told me early on when they were testing Oscilio, like if Oscilio ever gets a zero cost shock, he's going to be broken. Do you feel
If
the
it's
same way?
light, yeah, it would be very powerful. I think I would play a red 0 block. It just said shock. Didn't even have to be a melt card. I think I would
Wow.
probably play that in some matchups. Um, it would be very, very nice to have. That's for sure.
Because I'm imagining a case where, I mean, we talked about the potential for Storm Striders. I feel like a lot of the times your shocks can get Storm Striders esque value without being Storm
Mhm.
Striders.
Oh
Where
yeah.
I don't know, you play it, but you also like have a whole hand of sigils. You play the shock, you respond with a bunch of sigils and Volsar, and then all of a sudden,
hmm
here comes this big old shock on your opponent's turn.
Oh yeah, shock is something that is a little unique. People think Kano, oh, he just does his big combo. Icelander, it's like some combination of like, oh, I play a blue card from Arsenal, I maybe Strider's like an Emeritus, I throw away any moon, I'm getting to like, 11, 12 damage, something like that. Verdance is doing kind of more of like an action phase combo abusing, rampant growth. But like Oscilio doesn't really have that reach, at least in the style of deck I took without that shock. So, having 6 shock cards in the null shock and the comet storm shock kind of enables some of that strategy. And I definitely would not be unhappy to consider additional shock cards if they were printed in future sets or expansion slots or whatever it might be.
So this is our combo list. Is there anything we've kind of gone over what the combo looks like in general, which
Mm-hmm.
is usually recurring a ton of Gone in a Flashes. Is there anything deeper we need to go into in regards to the big combo turn?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about like, well, how do you set up for a combo turn? Because
Mm-hmm.
usually you're not just drawing into a mat. You're like, oh wow, look at that, it works. Usually it involves some kind of setup with either sigils or permanents or like channeling a channel lightning valley. Setting a card like God in the Flash or some key instant in your arsenal, something like that, and then drawing maybe. You're not looking for specific cards, but you're looking for like the right ratio of cards. On your combo turn, usually it's Gone in a Flash. Like you can have a combo turn without Gone in a Flash,
Mm-hmm.
but like the only card that probably gets you close is like Gone in a Blast or not. What is Blast to Oblivion? Not yeah,
Yeah.
mixing the two cards. But usually you need Gone in a Flash. That's really the only piece like must have important. Now there are things that enhance your combo turn that allow you to do things that are particularly disgusting, like carrying an embodiment of lightning over. It's an
Mm-hmm.
extra 4 damage because you get an extra action point and an extra use of Gone in the Flash, right? 5 points if you're actually getting the Volzar activation. So that's powerful. Sigil of Brilliance or Channel Lightning value, some way for you to leverage more than a 5 card hand. As you get to 6, 7, like maybe some crazy turn, you can get to 8. Like 6 or 7 is where you start to reach, like, I'm doing bonkers things. And so whether it's, oh, I set a Sigil of Brilliance on their turn or on my turn, Arsenal to Gone in Flash, drew 4 cards. Oh, maybe I drew an extra lightning attack. That's where the helmet comes in. I block with
Mm-hmm.
the helmet. I discard that lightning surge that's not good or that flittering charge or whatever it might be. I turn that into a Sigil of Brilliance, which is perfect for my combo turn, and I draw an extra card, which might also go into my combo turn. So being able to carry forward embodiments of lightning, being able to set extra cards, whether that's Sigil Brilliance or maybe you just channeled a Lightning Valley and you're carrying it over to your turn. If you're going to hit them with 5 Gone in the Flashes, your channel Lightning Valley is probably going to draw you a card if you carried it over. So, being able to extract the most from your combo turns requires you to have some sort of setup, right? And it plays into what we were talking about with the gloves. Maybe you have a bunch of sigils that are breaking, so now you have amp 2 or 3 on top of your combo turn. That's the identity of what you're doing. You're trying to basically set up game states where you're like, okay, depending on the texture of what my next 4 cards are, in combination with the arsenal, whatever permanents I might have on the board, I can go for this or I can pull the trigger type thing.
You mentioned something very early on in our conversation, and I want to reiterate it here because I think it's a really important part of understanding how Oscilio works. You mentioned that you use Flash of Brilliance to bounce your Sigil of Brilliance, you draw a card, etc. But then you said, and then on your combo turn, that Sigil of Brilliance gets turned into a Gone in a Flash. Let's talk about that one more time because I think that's so key.
Yeah, I mean, like to really highlight just how powerful the helmet is. Like it might seem a little unassuming. In an ideal world, you're using it for Sigil Brilliance. So like, let's say I play a turn cycle, nothing special. Maybe I go Lightning Search from Arsenal into Gone in a Flash. I maybe block 9 on your turn or something like that, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe I had a D-React to block 10, something like that. I use my last card to play Sigil Brilliance in response to bounce the Gone in the Flash. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I Arsenal the Gone in the Flash, I have the Sigil Brilliance in play. Let's say I have no further setup, right?
Mm-hmm.
Goes to your turn. Maybe on my redraw, my tunic's up. On my redraw, I draw, let's say Discharge, Mind Warp, Sigil of Solace, and maybe Flittering Charge, something like that. Well, I'm like, wow, this hand is so close to being good. It's so like potent. Well, they attack me. Let's say, oh, they don't have disruption or it's just a value turn. Like I find a spot to sneak in the Flash of Brilliance. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna block with this Flash of Brilliance, gaining 1 point. I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
discard this Flittering Charge, which this Flittering Charge is you. I mean, it's 0 for 4, which is
Yep.
fine. But if we're gonna break the boots, it's no different than just bouncing Gone in the Flash again. And a lot of your instants have incremental value, whether that's gaining health from Sigil, gaining additional power from Discharge, gaining amp from high voltage, playing a Sigil, which is going to carry that value in or make embodiments or draw your cards, etc. You're basically saying, hey, instead of Flittering Charge, I actually want Sigil Brilliance, which is still 4 damage because when you play it with your boots, you're going to bounce Gone in the Flash, giving
Mm-hmm.
you an action point to replay the Gone in the Flash. So you still have the Flittering Charge or whatever lightning card it was you discarded. Maybe it's Magnetism, right? You don't want Magnetism on your combo turn,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it might be. And then not only do you get that value from the card, if it's specifically Sigil Brilliance, you get to draw another card. So, like, let's say the card I drew happened to be another instant. I just gained, I already had, let's say, the 4 damage. We'll ignore the Volzar, right? Because it's going to be equal, assuming you're playing lightning cards.
Right.
I had the 4 damage from Flittering Charge. I turned it into 4 damage plus carrying forward a Sigil Brilliance, which is a card on your next turn. Then on top of that, I drew an extra card, which could be worth 5 damage from playing the Gone in a Flash another time. Even more if the instant is giving you value. Like, let's say the card you top decked was another Discharge. You just gained 8 points of value. So, like, in total, you gained 8 points of value from the extra card you drew. You maintain the 4 points of value from that. And then because you replay the Sigil, you get to draw an extra card on your next turn. You start reaching, like, really, like, bonkers levels, like almost as good as tutoring the Chi to play like Maragai or something like that. Maybe not quite, but it is the best comparison in my opinion.
It sounds addicting, honestly.
It is fun. It is fun. Like when you get to keep your whole hand and they don't take cards from you and you have like you can convert every card. You don't have like multiple wizard spells or whatever it might be. Um, it is disgusting. You can do some really broken things,
Mm-hmm.
which shows you the inherent power that Oscilio can have, even though it might not always be consistent. Like, you're not always going to get the dream combo turn. They might have some form of disruption, so you might be losing some cards, right? It might not be carrying the full thing. But if you can ever get that full uninterrupted combo, you're probably always winning the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always going to happen, is what you have to accept.
So, would you say that the most important part of learning to play this combo side of your two-sided Acilio deck is learning how to set up?
I do think that it is a requirement to know how to set up for your combo turns. However, usually when you're playing the combo package, it's against decks that can be more mid-rangey into you.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the second pillar that you really have to keep in mind is how to have good turns when you're not breaking the boots.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very easy for you to have like really subpar turns as a Cilio without the boots, or like if you don't have an embodiment of lightning, or you just drew a particularly bad hand, or maybe you can't filter with the Cilio, whatever it might be. Being able, if you can consistently achieve reasonable value cycles every turn, and then you have that one turn. It doesn't even have to be a super combo. Let's say they took a card from you because you had to turn off like a CNC or something like that with armor and a 3 block. Like if you're still spitting out like 26 damage, or 24, 25, something that's reasonable where like if they don't want to block you, they're taking a ton of damage, or if they block you, you gain full tempo plus you're chipping them or whatever it might be. That, in addition to you having reasonable turns throughout the rest of the game, allows you to accumulate enough value to actually win.
Excellent. Anything else to say, Alex, about the combo side of Oscilio before we switch to the mid-range side?
I think we hit pretty good on most of the kind of core tenets.
I think we did too. A lot of the team calls you a yapper, but I think you're a yapper with purpose, Alex.
Yes, we try to educate, that's for sure.
All right. Let's switch over to the matchup you call aggro mid range. I think that's referencing the match you're against, though, right? In terms of
Yeah.
the aggro side of it.
Aggro, blanket term for decks that are usually not wanting to block you a lot and also want to race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we touched on it a little bit earlier, Dio, Vis, Aurora being key decks. Mid-range, the coin, I guess, termed for this style of Oscilio where you're a lot more willing to block. You notice we bring in the D-Reacts.
Mm-hmm.
We cite out a lot of the no block cards that might not be as powerful, like I think High Voltage is out, and some of the other instance which could be liabilities in matchups where life is a very valuable resource.
Mm-hmm.
So, usually, and this was my strategy, tweaked a little bit depending on which of, we'll stick to the three premier aggro heroes it was to play for value and get a combo turn at some point, but it doesn't have to be maximum value. Like, when you're playing the full combo build, say against Florian, you really do need that like 30, 40 damage combo turn because you don't want to get fatigued and you want to ensure you get enough value. And you generally should be able to do that because you can use your life more liberally in those matchups. Now, it's a lot harder to employ that same strategy against a Dash IO who's like, boosting a ton of cards, they're playing items from the top of their deck, they're hitting you with devastating on hits, etc. Or Aurora, they've got uh it's what is it, burn up shock, right? On hit, basically another boom grenade, right? These are on hits you really want to stop. Viscerai similar, where their most devastating on hit is probably the ability to play Succumb if you've taken Rune Chance, which generally you're probably taking Rune Chance. So like one of the critical interactions against Viscerai is like, oh, maybe you took Rune Chance, they sent a like 3-go again or 4-go again or something. You didn't block it because it didn't make sense. They play
Mm-hmm.
this Succumb, you're like, oh, surprise, I actually have a D-react, so you're not going to hit me. So you have to throw another Chain Link, you have to have another attack action card. And then now it's face up that I could block this over just losing a card that you would pick anyways, right?
Yeah.
So I think what's more critical for this, we talked about kind of the two pillars of how you would play combo, where the combo is very important, but like the combo is not going to get you there if you have a bunch of 2 damage cycles, right? Like, oh, I block 6, I throw 2, whatever. That's usually not how you want to be playing. In the mid-range value strategy against these decks, those non-combo turns are even more important because you
Mm-hmm.
might not even get the opportunity to have a combo depending on how fast they go. Really critical that we were talking about like boom grenades, burn up shock. It's very important to stop those breakpoints if you're going to play a mid-range style into these decks. Like it's critical to not take those on hits if you can avoid it, because that's what's going to push your opponent into being able to outrace you. And so you really want to kind of gradually chip these life totals down in these mid-range matchups. And then, like we were talking about, there's shocks to end the game. Maybe you get a mini combo turn, but like Volzar for 4 on a Mind Warp breaks their back or something like that. Or it gives you enough tempo that like, oh, now I have a 4-card hand going into my turn, whatever it might be. You're not a no blocks let's race deck because you're not going to be successful doing that
Mm-hmm.
against what Dio was or even Aurora or Viscerai. They're usually going to be better at the no blocks race strategy than you, unless you get particularly a good first 15 cards of your deck to have a really strong combo turn really early. And so because you can't race them as consistently, I found that the strategy I was having the most success with was to be open to the idea of blocking more. And by trying to increase the blocking value of the deck as much as you can, and by being able to play 1 and 2 card hands a lot better, or having more armor, say in the case of Dio with Balance of Justice, really enables you to take those games longer to accomplish that strategy.
So what I'm hearing is not only are there two pillars to how to sideboard the deck, there are also two pillars to play each side of that sideboard, and which one is more important changes depending on the sideboard plan.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good way to look at it from kind of an overall view to encompass like what are some of the rough ideas I had when selecting this deck and how I wanted to play it into specific matchups. I think that, there's a little bit of divergence for little things here and there, but like those are the core tenets of the thought process and the ideology behind the deck. Yeah.
And it's interesting because those are two very core tenets of how to play the game in general, setup and turn cycle math.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so like a lot of what you're saying is just like be a good player, but also you're breaking it down in such an easy to digest way to play a very complicated hero.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's really challenging about this hero, and I think I definitely, if I had 2 more weeks on the deck, I would have been even more prepped
Mm,
for Worlds. Like, I don't think that I was an expert. I definitely made some mistakes at the tournament. The deck is very hard to play. You get so many decisions. Just think of all, I mean, it's very similar to Dio in the sense that, like, you have so many micro decisions that they have ripple effects. And unlike Dio, you don't get to see the top card of your deck. So you're
yeah.
like doing probability math of like, well, should I be activating Oscilio here? Do I need this card? Do I need to find a blocking card? Should I discard to look for a D reactor? Kind of what you were talking about earlier. Like, would a tech card here win me the game? Is there a reason I should dig for it, etc.?
Hmm.
Or maybe it's the inverse. It's like I'm trying to filter my hand so that I can convert it better on those mid-range turns that aren't actually investing the boots, right? There are a lot of ways you can play. There's a lot of technical sequencing interactions. The hero has a lot of opportunities to take different branching decisions.
And that's something that I think you are drawn to in general in this game,
I
wouldn't you say?
do I do enjoy the non-linear decks that ask you the hard questions or that are hard to pilot. I find it an interesting puzzle.
Well, Alex, you mentioned your mistakes, and I really want
Mhm.
to get into those when we get into your matchup spread. But before we move on, is there anything else we should say about the more mid range style of this deck?
I think high level we hit on it. Like again, depending on which hero you're playing,
Hmm.
you might swap some of these cards in and out. Like Null Shock is particularly good against heroes where you can use the null piece, or if you really value that shock piece. But you need to be careful against, say, like Dio. Like it being a no block is probably not worth it to have a 1 cost shock in your deck. But
Hmm.
you might play it against some other decks if you want the shock value, perhaps. Or, if you were going to play against a CYB deck, you might side in the Poison the Wells, even if, I guess for some reason, if you were deciding you want D reacts, that might be a bad example because I think any CYB deck is probably more mid range and you
Sure.
probably bring more into combo. But maybe you want the spindles because you want to set up or filter through your deck faster, right? Like there are small tweaks, but I think, you know, if you zoom out on the macro level, the ideology we walk through is like the thought process, and then you can be really flexible in your card slots. Like maybe you disagree, you don't need snags for new or whatever. You could add a lot of cards that are good in other matchups. Like Rewind is a card I tinkered with because like on Tunic you can really break a brute if you rewind Blood Arch Bellow, or if you play against a wizard and it's Kano and they break the Shriders and you rewind it, like that's pretty backbreaking. Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of interesting tech cards that we were talking about that are instants that the opportunity cost of including them in the Cilio is so low that you get a lot of creativity in how you can build your deck.
Exciting. And since you mentioned these sideboard cards, I hope we can find little bits when we're talking about the matchups to where you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of sprinkle in like, oh, maybe these come in there, these don't come
Yeah.
in there, etc. Before we move on, I do think this is something that I missed specifically in the combo side of things. I don't think Aether Spindle is by any means a surprise in Acilio decks anymore. But since you mentioned it here, maybe citing them in, citing them out, let's just give it a quick shout out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Aether Spindle's an interesting card. It also combos very well with Magnetism, which is what we were talking about before. Like if you pitch the blue to play Magnetism, well, you have the 2 pitch to play a 2 cost spell like Spindle.
Yep.
One of my favorite interactions with this card, what makes you feel like you're doing degenerate stuff, is let's say you have some sigil in play, like maybe you're playing a matchup where conductivity sticks. So your Volzar is free, which is nice. I
Sure.
pitch a blue. I play Magnetism. I say, okay, 2 cards in hand, 2 floating. How would you like to block? Most of the time you're leaking damage here. They're like, no blocks. I'm like, okay, cool. In reactions, I play Channel Lightning Valley. Any reactions? They're like, oh, that sucks. No, I have no reactions. I'll take damage. I'm like, okay, let's go to resolution. And resolution, I'll draw a card from Channel Lightning Valley. Oh, look at that. That's a great, or I guess technically you would order it in a way where you would do your spindle to opt, and you will opt the cards. Like, let's say your spindle's
Ah,
for,
yes.
let's say you amp 2, so it's for 6, and they decide not to block it, or they decide to AB3, you opt 3. You can actually opt the card you're going to draw. So you can opt your arsenal, and then you can opt 2 cards for your next turn. So maybe you see like Dawn and Flash, you're like, oh wow, this could be a combo turn, right? Like, oh, I see combo pieces here, whatever. Or maybe you just see a good hand interaction. Like, there are just certain cards that pair well together, say like Flittering Charge and Electromagnetic Somersault, where, it's just a 2-card 8, which is really powerful. It can be good if you're wanting to block or play value. So there's a lot of interactions, but in that particular cycle, that's one of my favorite ways to use Spindle, where I just channeled a Lightning Valley. I drew a card that I opted. I threw 10, 11 damage at you, and I carried a Lightning Valley into the next turn. It's like cookie cutter. I just set up a combo potential turn, right?
Speaking of knowing how to play that pillar of the deck.
Yeah, exactly. And there's all kinds. I think, the graphic we used earlier in talking about combo in general, like once you do it a few times, you understand like, okay, I understand how the combo is supposed to function. I think the real trick and the real technicality in playing good, clean Oscilio is being able to identify how you play the other, 7, 8 turns of the game that are not the turn you're breaking boots. And how well you're able to manipulate those, I think will determine how well situated you are to win any given game.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and get into those mistakes that I was talking
Mm-hmm.
about, Alex. Here is your matchup spread of day one at the World Championship. Viewers at home will note that we have his first draft pod listed in this day one breakdown, and that is because he brought Oscilio. More on that in a little bit. Let's go ahead and start with the Swiss rounds that made up rounds 1 through 5, Alex. Round
Mm-hmm.
one is a loss to my girl Azalea. Feeling pretty good about that. What happened, Alex?
Yeah, and I guess before we get into the details of it, maybe a real quick macro on like where I think Oscilio sits in the metagame
Please.
and like what matchups you're looking for, maybe what matchups you're not wanting to play. So like if we start with the most played decks, let's start with maybe the aggro bucket. So Aurora into Oscilio, I actually think is Oscilio favored. I think that you're usually pretty good. They're a little too fair. On average, I think you do pretty well into Aurora as long as you can stop getting hit by a burn up shock. Which you can do. And, I think if you're playing the D-Rax and you're disciplined in how you block, you're able to achieve that usually. The other aggro matchup, Dio, I feel like is a lot closer to a coin toss. Like it could go either way. Like how effective are you at blocking them? How crazy are their turns? Do they see a lot of sparks? Do they get a lot of good items off the top? So it can kind of go both ways. And then Viscerai, I feel like you're probably a little unfavored, but it's competitive. It's close. Like depending on how the cards go and how the decks are shuffled, like you can compete. So like overall, Oscilio was kind of okay into the aggro field, I would say. Like, you're a little favored here, a little unfavored here, kind of close to 50-50, and that's out to being okay. I thought that your Enigma matchup was decent. Like I think you're competitive. It's probably borderline 50-50. Depending on what build of Enigma it is, you might be slightly more or less favored depending on how they're playing. Maybe they're a CYB deck, and so they're applying less pressure, less on hits. Maybe it's a deck that's running like pummels or a lot of on hits like Phantasmaclasm, etc. So you might not have as much room to play the game. So that was my view on kind of the top 5. And then as you get into those secondary decks, you get decks like Azalea, Florian. Generally speaking, I think that Oscilio is pretty good against decks that want to play slow into you, such as Florian, because you get a lot of time to set up that really strong combo turn. And you just need to convert those other hands. Azalea is probably one of your worst matchups. It's really not one of the ones you want to play against. And no matter what deck you brought to this tournament, I think that most people were sacking some amount of matchups. And Azalea is one that I was like, I expect Azalea to be somewhat present. She's not going to be one of the most played decks, but I expect a decent amount. I'm okay accepting that this is going to be a hard matchup. If they lock you out with Red in the Ledger or they go first and hit you with big dominated arrows, it's an uphill climb. But, if you can find that window where you get that one turn, that's really all you need to push it over the edge. I think the only other big percentage of the meta deck that we didn't talk about, which was new, and I felt like with Snags, the matchup was very good for you. It is so satisfying for them to have a big hand and they play one of their majestic one attack. I
Persuasive
don't think they're spell
Prognosis
cards.
or
Yeah,
Bonds of
like
Agony.
Prognosis,
Yeah.
Bonds of Agony, like all the good stuff. Like block one with gloves. Any reactions? And then like, at the end you're like, all right, is that it? And they're like, yeah, I just played just a Nick and I played Hiss. I give it a go. I'm like, okay,
What do you
cool.
mean?
Here's
Is that it?
Snag. Yeah, and it's super value, super value. I one card blocked it. I have to have no fear. I don't have to have D reacts to play around it, whatever. And I guess one thing to note about Snag, which might be a little confusing for people who are maybe newer to the game, because this change happened a while ago, they errated the card so that it works retroactively. So even though the text on the card doesn't seem that way, there is a bulletin somewhere that explains it, with the judge community and all those people who write the policies for us to to follow, where you can use it retroactively. So it is a super good D-React where, they use their Just a Nix, whatever, and you get super value by basically negating those cards, which are some of the most powerful cards in their matchup. And it also stops you from having to worry about the on-hit, which is so critical. Like, they thought they were going to hit you with this effect, rip cards from your hand, etc. And now they're like, wow, I just did like 3-card 1 damage. That was horrible. And like that can really break their back.
And I probably
So
took like 12 damage to do it too.
exactly, exactly. And so like that goes into some of the pieces that like I really wanted those snags because it increased my equity so much in that matchup. Whereas if you weren't playing the snags, you have to be a lot more careful about the disruption and things like that. And you're a lot more susceptible to getting blown out by like just a Nick or a lot of those other reactions that can be really potent. So that's kind of overall high level, some of the matchup spreads. I guess getting into round one, we talked about it. Azalea probably one of the decks I really didn't want to see the most. This matchup was actually surprisingly close, despite it being bad, and things really also not lining up particularly well. I think they went first and sent a big dominated arrow, which not a great start, and then they hit me with a lot of the red in the ledgers, and my deck didn't really cooperate particularly well. But I'll say the only reason the game was even close, and I had some chances to win if things lined up slightly differently, was because of the equipment they presented into me. This Azalea flipped up. AB2 Spell Void 2. So they had
Mm,
the skull, they had the Arcanite chess piece,
no
and they
way.
had, Skullbone, bracers, and they had Spell Void boots, which I'm like, this is perfect. Like, this is the equity I'm looking for. Like the Spell Void 2, yeah, it's cool or whatever, but like, Snapdragon Scalers is so important for you to be able to push cards, or like tunics, so you don't have to pitch cards. Like this Spellboy 2 is cool, and like yeah, it would probably give you more equity into Kano maybe, but like this is where Oscilio can prey on like, oh, maybe I only know how my deck wants to play against Kano. I'll just play my Kano package into Oscilio, and you're like, well, perfect, because you didn't have snaps, you just lost out on 7 damage on this
Right.
turn or whatever it might be, and because of that, the game was actually surprisingly close, but ended up kind of losing, but. You know, I came in with the expectation that Azalea was not my great matchup. I'm not generally expecting to win this. I was okay with that. Um, Round two, I guess I played against Azuri, not the assassin that I did most of my prep into. And in fact, I don't play snags into Azuri either. I think that it's a little more volatile into them. You could maybe make the argument that you should. But I played into it more like a mid-range deck, with more of an emphasis on combo to have really strong turns and push it through. Of course, you have D-Reacts to use against them if you're concerned about different on-hits or assassin tricks, which a lot of them have. So that matchup went well, and I ended up winning it. And then in round three, I lost a really close one to Aurora. And while I think I made a lot of small, mostly non-game defining mistakes this tournament, this is probably the one game where I made my biggest blunder. I think that in some of the inexperience or early rounds of CC here, I made some mistakes that definitely cost me this game. I think if I played this game perfectly, I should have won every time. And it's always tough to look back on those and say, well, it's unfortunate that you didn't pilot this deck to the level you needed to get those games. But it just goes to show the complexity of the deck. And like, I really wish I had 2 more weeks on the deck going into Worlds. If I did, I feel very confident that this matchup would have been a win. But alas, on the tournament day, you got to bring your best. And, if you don't play it your best, you might not win your games, right?
And
So I
at this
accept.
point, Alex, I want to take just a quick detour after round three, because if we
Mhm.
take a piece of paper and cover everything up except for up to round three, you've got an auto loss basically into an Azalea that kind of high rolled. You've got a win that you squeaked out against a fringe deck, and then you've got a loss into one of the matchups that you felt comfortable on, one of the ones that encouraged you to bring the deck. And at this point you really have to bounce back, right? And this is something that is so hard for a lot of Flesh and Blood players to do, and I think it's something that you do incredibly well. How do you stay level headed at this point? How do you basically push through? What's your mindset like?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, you're totally right that Aurora is one of those decks that, like, this is one of the decks. If I play Aurora every round, I'm like, I picked the perfect deck, right? Um, I think especially when you make the mistake and you know it caused it for you, it can be tough. But I think you just have to look back, like, hey, even if you play perfectly, you might have lost. Use it as a learning experience. Like, okay, I know what I did wrong. If I play more Auroras, which you probably will, given how popular it was, I know how to fix that and not repeat that. And, you got to take it as a learning experience. I think I also felt very confident and prepped for the draft portion. So I really wanted to get to draft. I was like, okay, I just need to, like, not totally bomb out of CC. That was my plan. I'm like, hopefully, when you get to the lower queues of the CC rounds, especially when you're starting, you can get some really fringe decks, some things that you haven't prepared for. So, like, when you get into that bracket, you're kind of in the Wild West. And so it's a little scary, but the best you can do is just keep trudging along. You're never out until you're out. And, you can be X2 and top eight. You can be X2 and make day two. You can do all kinds of amazing things from the X2 position, even though 1-2 is probably not how you'd prefer to start a tournament. Your run is not done, and you have to give it your best in every game to give yourself the best shot.
Inspiring words for sure. So let's move on to a couple of those extra wins that you got out of that first round of Swiss. Round four is against a KO. Any issues
Mhm.
there, or was it a pretty good steamroll?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of my games were very close. Like, win or lose, I think very close on a lot of them. I think this one was no different. The balance of justice is an interesting decision of should you play it against Brute or should you not. This game ended up being very close, but I actually think that we talked about how the Azalea sideboarded into me. I think that brutes like Kale have a really hard time because they really get punished depending on how they sideboard into you. Like, if they play AB3, they don't have, say, Fleshbag, right? Which Fleshbag on your combo turn can be worth like 7, 9 points, something crazy, right? Especially if you take a card that they really needed. Maybe you took their non-attack action they wanted to play with Volzar, something like that. But then if you have no AB, you can also just get chipped really hard by, like, Magnetism Spindle, Comet Storm. Here's just 3 Chain Links and then a Mind Warp. I only have to amp my spells by, 2 if you have AB1, or if you have some KOs would play AB0 to have, the beaten trackers and the full armor suite with Sash and Bonebreaker. So you really ask a lot of hard questions. And I think you being comfortable pivoting between, oh, they flipped up full armor, I'm going to lean more on Arcane on hits. Oh, they flipped up a lot of AB, I'm going to play towards a really good Ganon Flash turn because there's no downside. Being able to identify that and how you should play into them, depending on what equipment you flip up, is very pivotal. But it was a close game. I ended up getting there. And then in round 5, I got Prism, which, aside from Azalea, is probably also one of your worst matchups. Like, I practiced this a little bit, but I also kind of went into the tournament with the expectation this is a matchup I'm willing to sack. I didn't expect more than maybe like 3% Prism. I'm like, okay, if I run into Prism, I'm okay sacking it. So I play against Prism, and my strategy actually going into the tournament was, if I play against Prism, I'll just play full combo and I'll just hope that I get a really good combo and I'm able to close the game because I'm not expecting to survive long, etc. Surprisingly, and this happened for most of my CC games, I lost the dice roll and my opponent picked to go first. And I'm like, do I really want to play all these no blocks and a bunch of really bad cards that I can't block with if a Prism goes, here's a Herald for 7, here's a Herald for 7 on turn 1? I'm like, that doesn't sound good. So I went with a kind of a gut call in the moment. I was like, I'm going to play the D-Reacts. I'm going to play more defensive. I'm going to kind of value this game and see how it goes. Like, I went in with low expectations. I'm like, this is probably not great, but my gut tells me this is how I should play this matchup given the context of how I was forced to play in the game. And this actually, surprisingly, was probably the game I won most decisively in the entire tournament. I think I won on 20 life. I blocked 3 eruditions from hitting me, which was very, very helpful in winning the game. If those eruditions hit me, we would have lost. But you'd be surprised with the armor you have and deep reacts, how effective you can be at blocking cards. And Oscilio can be deceptive. This is true for the aggro matchups as well, where he can block a lot more than you might expect, especially if you don't have a lot of reps against Oscilio. Like, you go in as Dio and you're like, let's boost, let's race, let's race. And you're like, why are they blocking me? Like, my boom grenades aren't hitting. Like, this is a problem. So It's surprising it worked out that way, but an interesting matchup for sure. The cards lined up nicely for me, and is able to take it down with that kind of on the fly adaptation.
And with that, Alex, you've taken a 1-2 start into a positive win rate going into draft, which is your comfort zone. You've put
Hmm.
a lot of drafts into this. I know this for sure, and I know that will be the case in every season that comes to follow. Um, the first pod, you draft Oscilio. Talk me through the draft process, just kind of generally at first. When did you know you were in the Oscilio seat, and how were you feeling once you knew?
Yeah, so I think that this pod, my seat kind of sculpted itself. My pack one pick one was Comet Storm, which is probably one of the key cards you want to see for Cilio. I feel very comfortable drafting the set, so I kind of know like, okay, when am I taking cards to see if the lane is open? When am I staying open to try and read signals? And Comet Storm is definitely one of those cards where I value this as like, this is bread and butter why you want to be a Cilio. So I started in Comet Storm, started sending signals like, hey, you shouldn't be what I am. And the signals I was receiving kind of lined up with my expectation that this is going to be a good Oscilio
The
pod. So
dream.
I kind of started Oscilio. I didn't receive any contrary information. I'm like, perfect. We'll just lock it in. We'll keep sending the signal, make sure the people on my left aren't. And I think that this pod, I believe, was one Oscilio. So I was the only Oscilio, one Verdance. So two Wizards, two Aurora, and what is that? Three or four or two? That's four, and then four Florian, right? So it was six Runeblade, five Earth,
Wow.
three Lightning, two Wizard. So I was in probably the best seat if you talk about access to the most cards. I was a one of two Wizard, a one of three Lightning. This was also probably I did 75-ish plus minus drafts leading into Worlds. This was probably one of the top three best decks I ever drafted.
Wow.
It was insane. I had a bunch of ways to surge go again. I had a bunch of powerful cards like Comet Storm. I had a plethora of sigils. I had premium lightning cards. I was killing most of my opponents in like 3 turns, and there was
Oh my
nothing they could do to
gosh.
interact. I'm like 4 arcane, 3 arcane, 8 arcane, and it was disgusting. Like I felt like most of my games were non-games. The deck basically won for itself. I played against two Florians, right? Which, despite being oversaturated in Earth and a one of six Runeblade, right? Like one still made it to the 2-0
Right.
finals. And like some of them have Majestics and power cards and things like that. But like, especially with how diluted their decks were and how potent my deck was, like they really were non-games. And fortunate that it lines up, not a very technical draft in that sense. Like I had a relatively easy pack one pick one, and just the pieces fell together for it to, line up and have a powerful deck.
Well, you said the draft was fairly easy, and I believe that for you. But there's easy when you're doing your first draft of Rosetta, and there's easy when you're doing your 75th draft of Rosetta, which was your case. And I think that is highlighted so much in the fact that I think in general a lot of people at Worlds were shying away from Lightning, and so maybe that was just the more open window, as it were. But I think because you had 75 drafts, like you knew when Lightning was open, and you also had the confidence to play it, which I think is
Mhm.
not the case for everybody who was at Worlds.
Yeah, I think critical for any draft format you're playing at a competitive level, you have to be willing to play any draftable hero in the set.
Hmm.
If for whatever reason you're uncomfortable playing a certain hero, you are forfeiting equity for no reason. If your seat is supposed to be that hero, you need to play that hero. That's always my mindset. I'm not really a draft forcer. I always try to identify like what is the best way, what is the best strategy for this set? How do I want to draft which is going to give me the most powerful opportunity to win the pot? I'm playing to win the pot, especially given how the tournament started 3-2. I'm really looking to 3-0 and kind of give myself equity for top 8 still. But yeah, I think Earth heroes are definitely more consistent. A lot easier to go 2-1 plus with a very mid or weak Earth deck, as evidenced by the two Florians playing me in the 1-0 and 2-0 bracket, despite there only being the three Lightning heroes. But being able to pilot those decks and comfort in playing any of them allows you to get those seats where, let's say you're drafting with 5 people who don't want to play Lightning, and you're willing to play Lightning, and you're getting like a red Lightning Surge pick 6. You're like, well, I mean, I'm just winning, right?
Hmm.
So I think having that comfort to draft all the heroes is really important. And you should have that in any format you're drafting, in my opinion.
So no forcing.
No, well, I mean, I think you can lean into cards and say, I'm likely to play this hero. But I'll give you an alternate reality, right? I'm always pack one picking the Comet Storm.
Mhm.
Objectively, with whatever my pack was, I was like, this is the right pick. It's always the right pick. Let's say I start receiving signals that like either Oscilio's not open, Lightning's not open, like I'm not seeing good cards, or maybe I'm getting past particularly powerful Earth cards or something like, I am not above sacking the pick and going into something else if I think that's going to give me the best chance to win the pod. It just happens that the dream world lines up when you lean into powerful cards. Maybe you found a majestic or something good, and then the signals you receive align with that. When that happens, it's like the stars align for your seat. You're going to have a great pod if you identify that. Now, it's not going to happen every pod. Sometimes when you make those kind of siloed decisions in the draft process, you have to accept that you're willing to cut your losses at some point and go somewhere else. And with, I guess, real high level on the draft format, I call it the quadrant approach for this. I am a big believer for the Rosetta format that you should really be on one quadrant, whether it's the elemental quadrant of Earth or Lightning or Wizard or Runeblade. And then you really want to wait as long as you can generally to identify which, corner of the quadrant you're going to actually end up in. I think that the discipline in doing that successfully will help you navigate to those seats more respectively. Like if Earth is really overdrafted but Wizard is underdrafted, you can still have a very powerful Verdansk deck if you're able to identify that, right? But
Mhm.
if you lock into your hero early, like you do with the meld cards or some of the other things, or what you're trying to do, you can kind of isolate yourself where you can set yourself up for a train wreck if you're not willing to, pivot on the signals you're seeing.
So I want to reiterate that real quick. Like, if we're going to split it in Rosetta to four quadrants, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
start on a half, right? Either
Mm-hmm.
Runeblade, Wizard, I'm sorry, Runeblade, Wizard, or Earth, Lightning, and then
Yes.
designate yourself into the quadrant later.
Yes, this is
Beautiful.
something I learned at the world premiere the hard way. Granted, it was the first time I drafted, and not however many I had since then. But I ended up in an overdrafted Earth pod as an overdrafted Florian, and if I was just a little more patient, I could have ended up as Verdansk instead of Florian because I had started Earth, and my Verdansk deck would have been insane. Like my Florian deck
Mm.
had so many chaff Wizard cards. I'm like, wow, if I was just Verdansk, my deck would have turned out so much stronger than what it ended up as. And so I think having that flexibility, I found, was one of the most critical draft components for this set.
Mm. So let's move on to day two. I have not listed your draft pod that day, even though it's important to
Mm-hmm.
note you went 3-0 again on
Uh-huh.
a
With
lightning hero,
Aurora.
no less, but it wasn't Oscilio, which is why I don't have it listed here. And so that makes me very glad that we had that conversation about the lightning heroes in general, because it seems like you found a similar pod the next day. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, so the second pot was a little bit more interesting. It wasn't as like slam dunk pack one, pick one. I guess to go through my draft logic for those who might be curious, I recall the pack one, pick one very, very well. It was actually a pack that had three like S tier wizard cards. It was like
Mm.
red exploding aether, like a red etchings, and like a red trailblazing aether. I'm like, wow, if I take one of these, or if I pass any of these cards, there's surely going to be a lot of people who say, wow, these are great wizard cards I'm getting past. I should be wizard. So I was already thinking from the get go, like, okay, not 100%, but I probably want to pass these three really good wizard cards and see what lane I should end up in. And I want to say my pack one pick one was actually the only good lightning card, which was like a red flittering charge or something like
Mm.
that. And I was like, okay, I'll identify, like, I could be Oscilio, I could cut this go Earth, I could be Aurora, whatever. And I tried to identify my lane. I ended up in the Aurora deck. I ended up being able to 3-0 that with some close games, playing the Aurora Mirror. I think that pod was one Oscilio also, two Aurora, um, and then some break. I don't recall exactly what it was between the Florian and Verdansk. I think it was like two Verdansk, two Florian, something like that. So it was more split. But again, in both of my pods, it was three Lightning, five Earth, which I think is probably roughly standard for a lot of the
Hmm.
pods at Worlds. If you end up with like four or five Lightning heroes, like you're gonna get gobbled by the Earth decks.
Yeah,
But
it could be pretty
if
rough.
if you can find the open seat, it is good.
Okay, so we're back into CC at this point, Alex.
Yes.
You're sitting at a clean only X2 at this point, and
Yes.
we hit some bumps in the road. Let's talk about those.
Yeah, so round 12 was actually a feature game. So if anybody wants to see that, they can watch it. Like we kind of talked about, out of the aggro pillars, Viscerai is probably the deck you don't want to see. You're a little bit unfavored. I think that it can be bad depending on how the cards line up, etc. I think that this game was really close, despite kind of having a really bad start to the game. So I think just the way that the cards lined up, it just wasn't going to be one of those games that you close the gap against Viscerai. Although we talked about like little mistakes and stuff made throughout the tournament, and I think that this is a nice game to highlight. Like, I always, whether I'm winning or losing, I always like to think about like how did the game I just played go? Like, are there things I could have done better? Are there mistakes I could have improved on, etc.? And while the Aurora loss in round three, I think it was 100% my fault, and I should have played better and won. You get into some interesting spots of like, well, what was technically correct in some of these, and it's not as objective of if you were wrong or not. And I think I played this game pretty well. But I think that there was maybe one slight miss sequence on the turn that I actually chose to broke my boots, which I guess if any Oscilio enjoyers like to review games and try and figure out what you can do better to improve. My post game thought was that on the turn I broke the boots, where I had two Gone into Flashes, I opted to play the Channel Lightning Valley out initially, face up to gain the action point from the boots, and then throw the Gone in the Flash. But I think it actually would have been a more interesting play to start with the Gone in the Flash because I don't necessarily need to bounce it since I have a second one. And then it's extremely likely that he's not going to block it. Now, I thought if he blocked it, I was like, well, he'd probably have to give up his chess piece, which I'm super happy if he wants to do that anyways. To turn off my Channel Lightning Valley. But, it's the little things like that with the Oscilio that you wonder, like, well, if I did that and I drew an extra card or I changed things around a little bit, like I could have gotten there. I could have done things differently. But, overall, I was pretty happy with my play this game. I think there's little things like that in every game. It's like, oh, should I have discarded here? Should that have lined up, etc. But, it just wasn't in the books for that run out.
And you bring up a good point, Alex. Can we mention to the Oscilio beginners that might be watching this video why you cannot play the Channel Lightning Valley to bounce your Gone in a Flash?
Yeah, so
Or
it
maybe why it's suboptimal.
yeah, so the key wording with Gone in a Flash is that in order to or when it resolves, right, the next time you play an instant, you get the trigger. Usually, you want to trigger it in resolution. However,
Which is
there are
after damage
exceptions.
has gone through.
Yes, so you go to damage because you want to deal damage to them,
Mm-hmm.
and you go to resolution and you usually bounce it. This is really critical when you have things like embodiments of lightning, quicken tokens, etc. If you bounce the attack before resolution, not only will you not get the damage, but you will not get the go again from whatever token it was that's going to
Mm-hmm.
give that to you. So if you're valuing that action point, it's very important you go to resolution. And the thing that's tough about Channel Lightning Valley is if you play it in reactions, you can now no longer bounce that Gone in a Flash. And if you play it in resolution, you've already done damage, so you're not going to draw a card. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like the worst of both worlds, where one of the biggest mistakes that I think you can make against an Oscilio is actually blocking the first Gone in a Flash because it's a mega punish to break the
Mm-hmm.
boots and play the Channel Lightning Valley. Because now I bounced it, I didn't hit you, so perfect. Now my on hit's on for the next Gone in a Flash, and I converted my Lightning Valley into another Gone in a Flash, which is it's like perfect. So that's probably one of the things that most people playing against Oscilio didn't realize, but super important if you're playing against Oscilio, do not block the first Gone in a Flash because if they have Channel Lightning Valley and they're going to break boots, you just gave them free value for no reason. So there's sorry Oscilio enjoyers, but that's probably something you should do if you're playing against Oscilio.
And it's this same phenomenon which forces a lot of Oscilio players, I think, to cut Lightning Press. Same as you. I don't think you were
Mm-hmm.
running Lightning Presses, right?
I was not, no.
Because it
But yeah,
doesn't synergize super well with Gone in a Flash.
yeah, you got to be very careful because those interactions are important. Now, of course, it doesn't always matter. And like I said, I think part of my mistake was overvaluing how much I needed action points. Like I was maybe a little too greedy. I mean, I think the line I took was fine, but I think it might have been better overall to flash it in and just decline the bounce since I had the second Gone in a Flash and I could bounce that one repeatedly to
Mm.
confirm I would get the card draw. But like it's little things like that that are fun to analyze and figure like, well, normally you would want to bounce this Gone in a Flash, but because I had two, I don't need to, or things like that, where you deviate from maybe your standard lines for whatever might be going on, right?
Awesome. So then you run into another Aurora and you right your wrongs from day one.
Yeah, and I'm like, this is the point. I'm like, all right, we're X3. I think at this point we need every win we can get. Like, let's get some good matchups. I see Aurora. I'm like, perfect. Like, this is not what I don't want to play against. Let's do it. So I sit down from Aurora. This game was super nail biter. Like, we're like 2-1. We end up like 2-1 or something like that. And this game comes down to exactly what I was talking about earlier. We're throwing like 4-4, block 2 cards, 4-4. Like, that's how we're getting there. And what's crazy is I'm on 1. I think he's on 2 or 1 or something like that. We're like super in game. And I'm doing my 4-4 back to him. And after blocking and going to 1 himself, he's like, you have no cards in hand? I'm like, no. He's like, you have none floating? I'm like, no. He's like, okay, I'm going to play this Burn Shock for 1, presenting lethal. But the card I had in my arsenal was Sigil of Solace. So I was like, Sigil of Solace, stay alive. He's like, oh. He's like, I didn't even know if you were playing them because he hadn't seen any. So like, had the right card at the right time. And then what's crazy is, so he kept 2 cards. I'm on 1. He's like, Lightning Surge from Arsenal, 4 Gogan. I'm like, Tunic, 3 block, block 4. He's like, 4 from hand. I'm like, no cards in hand. He's like, no. I'm like, Comet Storm Shock with like 2 lightning cards. You're dead, you know? So it was the reverse shock. It was actually
Wow.
crazy. But it goes to show you, you get to those game states. Like, I think Oscilio is really good at closing those game states against Aurora, which is one of the reasons I like the matchup a lot. So was able to get there, very close, but we did get there. Um, yeah, and then I guess moving into round 14, I'm like, another Aurora, perfect. Now what's interesting about this game is this was Rob Catton who ended up winning Swiss. His Aurora build was actually a little bit different than what I was expecting and then what most Auroras were playing. He was playing Coaxes, he had Exudes, which he exudes, even though he might not have known I was playing D-Reacts or whatever, the Exudes ended up being extremely good against some of the hands I had. The game still ended up being extremely close. I lost it by the thinnest of margins, but it was a really good game. And I think some of his specific deck choices, which weren't common against what I would have expected from Aurora, helps him squeak out more equity, I think, than he otherwise would have had into Oscilio. So, he played it well, and it was a great game. I had a pleasure, playing all my games, really. But I ended up losing it just barely due to some of the unique deck building constraints, I think, that he included, which hurt me. So unfortunately, I think that loss then knocked me out of top 8. So I'm like, okay, we'll play the last game. We'll hope to do our best. We got another Viscerai, which I was like, it's not great, but at least we're not live for top 8 anymore, so I can't complain that much, So I ended up playing this. This was a really close game. This was a little bit different than the other Viscerai I played, where this deck was one of the like really aggressive. I want to play a bunch of zero cost things, go really hard, a lot of no blocks. This one flipped Spellfray Tiara into me, which was interesting. Again, going back to a lot of people disagreed, didn't have a consensus on what kind of equipment to play into you. I think the Aurora I lost to also had Spell Void 3,
Oh,
AB
wow.
3. So they had less armor too, which like,
Oh, wow.
we talk about pivoting. Or like if you play Kato into that, it's like, ooh, that sucks. But you
Right.
play Cilio into that, you're like, okay, I'll just adapt how I
You're
play a
like, yeah,
little bit.
whatever.
But yeah, I played into the other Viscerai. I ended up losing. It was pretty close. I recall the succumbs being really brutal in this matchup. Like he had the third succumb in a spot where I was like gambling. He didn't have it, and it kind of blew me out. So I ended up 4-5 in CC. Although one of the games was definitely my fault, and then the Azalea game was close to an auto loss with how it came, and then the other 3 games I lost were like really close. Things just didn't quite line up. So maybe not the most impressive showing for a deck, but it might be a lot closer than you think. And I think some things to highlight is that in my testing, usually you can get some kind of combo or mini combo turn most games. Like I would say at least 25 to 50% of your games. You might not get the nut combo, but you could do something with your boots, which is really important to do that. And in my 9 rounds of CC, I don't think I comboed anybody, actually. And
Wow.
in all my games, which probably not where you want to be with the deck. The cards just didn't line up. In some of the matchups, it's not as important, right? Like in the aggro ones, like you maybe want more mini combos or things like that. But
Yeah.
I really did not get good boots value against anybody other than Prism. And the Prism game, it wasn't even really a big combo turn. It was more like, I guess, they don't have a lot of life. They don't have a lot of armor. I'm just going to convert this to damage kind of thing. So I think that my deck didn't uh, roll out, I guess, consistently, let's
Mm-hmm.
say, which that's a risk I accepted playing Oscilio. It's one of the
Mm-hmm.
downsides of like the deck is not consistent. It's not always going to do the thing. And that's one of the reasons why it's not, a best deck in the format. But like, if the way my decks were shuffled and the hands I drew and the hands my opponents drew were shuffled differently or things like that, I could have definitely seen a timeline where this could have been a top 8 run. If I didn't throw the Aurora game, maybe I squeaked out one of the Viscerai games, or maybe I didn't play an Azalea, or I ended up going 1-2 into Aurora despite thinking it's a great matchup. Although one of those was definitely my fault, and the other one was really close. But just some parting words on that. I think the deck is good. I think unlike a lot of the other decks people write off, which maybe just don't even have win conditions, or those win conditions are so wildly infeasible that you'll never get there,
Mm-hmm.
Acilio is like very close.
Yeah.
Like the things you do are inherently powerful. Your off turns can be inherently powerful. Like you play very similar to a Roomblade, like 4/4/4. Like, wow, that's a really good 3-card hand. And being able to do that as Acilio, I think, is a lot more consistent than a lot of other fringe decks, but it's still not as consistent as a lot of the most competitive decks. So just some things to keep in mind.
Okay, so that's a really important retrospective, right, Alex? And
Yeah.
to sum it all up, if you had to play another tournament in this same meta, call it, I don't know, calling Portland or something, um, would you bring Acilio?
Good question. I will say I had a blast playing Oscilio. I really did. It super fun deck. I love decks where I finish the game and I sit there and I think I'm like, wow, what could I have done different? How could I have
Mm,
sideboarded differently? How could I have navigated these turns different? I love that complexity. So I got to say, Oscilio is a deck I enjoy playing. I'm not opposed to playing it more. Portland going to be slightly different, probably with the latest BNR. Although, I do plan on being there and I might play Acilio. There's, it's definitely a possibility. I think that if I could run Worlds back, I'm totally satisfied with my deck. Like, even though 4/5 might seem like something you're like, wow, that really is not what you want to see, especially like off a 6/0 not being able to convert. Like that sucks. But I think that I was satisfied with my 80. I had a good plan. A lot of the assumptions around my pick were true, which is good. It's like, okay, I
hmm
picked a deck for the right reasons. I think my logic was sound. I just think it just wasn't the tournament for things to happen. And I think that I did need more practice on the deck. Like I had a lot of games on the deck, but when you lose games due to mistakes, you didn't have enough practice. Is how it boils down to. So if I had 2 more weeks on the deck, maybe we'd be in a different timeline here. But alas, this is the reality.
And even at 4 or 5, we're still talking about a top 32 finish, aren't we?
Yeah, yeah. I think what's funny is I think there were 3 Acilios in the tournament. So losing my last 2 rounds, I think I scrubbed down to like 29th, and
hmm
then a nice guy I met there, another Acilio player, finished 30th. He was playing next to me in the last round. We unfortunately both lost our last rounds for top 16. I think it would have probably been, but I spoke with him a bit. He's from South Korea. I would say his name, but I would butcher it. Sorry. But yeah, I'm sure you could pull it up on the final standings for Worlds. He was right under me at 30th. But we were talking at the tournament because he was also playing Acilio, and we had a really good talk. And I think his deck was a lot different than mine. It just goes to show you, the deck is not solved. There's different takes on it. There's a lot of creative freedom you can have in how you play. And for two of three of them to convert to top 32, even if my CC performance wasn't the best, I think speaks to the viability of like the deck is not a say a Betsy or something that you write off for Olympia. You're like, well, there's no reason to play, Olympia or Warriors in general over
Oh,
Dory or
be
something like
careful. We've
that.
got to have us Olympia and Betsy players in the audience. Let's be careful
Well,
here,
yeah, no, no,
Alex.
no, no. I mean, hey, play what you want. I speak from general consensus of what a lot of people in the community echo, or like, you see a lot of those tier lists and things leading into Worlds. A lot of people put heroes like Acilio and like this is you should just not play this deck. It's not competitive, it's not consistent, etc. But I think that the deck is stronger than people give it credit for. It might not be the most consistent or one of the pillars of the format, but you could definitely do well with Oscilio.
Awesome. And I want you to soapbox for a moment about how important draft is, because the way you start every single season, the first meeting of the AGE Pro team, here comes Alex. harping on how you have to do well in draft because da 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 da. All very good reasons because we're talking about a 4-5 CC record that placed top 32 at a tier 4 event.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I want you to have your opportunity to tell our audience exactly how important draft is at these events.
Oh, it is immensely important. And the thing is Flesh and Blood players have improved so much over the years. The competition is so fierce.
Mm.
Uh, the argument I always make is the edge you're going to gain in CC against the best of the best players is so small. You're fighting for literal scraps
Mm.
of percentage points. And like you can gain edges and you can have small things. And like if you find some secret broken thing, you can really break out and do some things. But in my opinion, and I think this has been true for a while, the biggest equity edge you can get in these competitive split format events is in draft. I think that the skill gap, like while Flesh and Blood players have improved and a lot of them are good, I think that it is more applicable to CC than draft. I think a lot of people sack draft. A lot of people talk themselves into draft is not as important. If I don't
Mm-hmm.
have a good CC deck, I can't win. The top 8 is CC, etc. I think that it is fundamental to your success. Like you can't bomb draft in top 8. Like if you had the inverse of me and you 9-0'd CC, but you won 5 draft,
Mm-hmm.
you also wouldn't be top 8 or 2-4 draft or whatever. So it's balanced. You need to do good in both. But the argument I always make is I think you will gain more equity by being a better draft player relative to the average skill of the field than you will be by being a better CC player relative to the average of the field. And then I guess my meme answer is just don't play Kano because apparently if you play Kano, you can't draft. So just give it up and things go well. But I think it really helps that the draft sets have been just so fun, so creative. I think that, heavy hitters, Mistveil, Rosetta are some of the best draft sets that LSS has produced. And I've really enjoyed trying to solve these very complex formats, very diverse drafting strategies. Like all the heroes play slightly different. It feels like such a fun puzzle to crack. And I got to say, I'm really enjoying Limited. I really hope LSS does more limited events because I really have been enjoying their draft sets and that draft experience.
If Brian Gottlieb is watching this, I know he's shedding a
Yeah.
very solemn, beautiful tear. And I'm sure he's going to be very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to finish with the maxim that wizard players can't draft, but you are by far the biggest exception to that rule, Alex.
We
Um,
tried. We tried.
I think that about does it for me, man. I want to reframe my earlier question about taking Oscilio to another tournament.
Mm-hmm.
Ice is coming back, Alex. Does
Ice is
Oscilio
coming back.
have a snowball's chance in hell with ice in the format?
Ice is probably not good for Oscilio. A lot of your turns are pitch exact. The
Mm-hmm.
reason you want that one resource is to break your boots and literally nothing else. You don't want to be playing Volzar. Like, Ice is probably not something Oscilio wants to see. It'll be interesting to see how the Jarl matchup shapes up, because usually you're pretty good into the mid-range decks, but a card like Blizzard is probably going to break your back. Although, maybe you don't need to go again. Maybe you can cheat
Maybe
the
it's just
action
the action
points.
points.
But
Yeah.
you got to be careful because Jarl's a little specific in the sense that he can give you frostbites. So you need to be careful of that because frostbites are impactful. And of course, he can destroy equipment. And if he destroys your boots, you're probably not going to have a fun time. So keep that in mind. We'll see how it shapes up. But I think overall, Ice is probably not what you would prefer to play against as Oscilio.
Makes sense to me. Well, any last words about Oscilio, Alex? I'm so stoked that you had fun on this deck. You make me want to play this deck.
It is a fun deck. Like if you've not played Oscilio, maybe outside of Rosetta Draft, I definitely encourage it. If for nothing else, to learn how the deck plays so you can play against it. Because I will say, even at the world level, most people I played against, I think, were not playing the right cards into me. We're not sideboarding correctly. We're not necessarily taking the right lines, which was part of the reason I brought the deck. Is I brought the expectation that a lot of people would not have practiced this matchup a lot leading into Worlds, and I expect that to probably not be true moving forward. So
Mm.
that window is gone. But if it's a deck that's not going to be popular, people usually don't practice against it. But there's a lot of small mistakes you can make against Oscilio that punish you really hard. A good example I always give is like against Dorinthia, especially way back in the day. Like if you have no clue how Dorinthia plays or how you need to play into her, she will punish you extremely hard for small missteps, small miss sequences. I think there are a lot of interactions against Oscilio that are not quite as punishing as say like a Dawnblade Dory, but like there are things that can break the game open and you can win out of nowhere because your opponent gifted it to you. right?
Absolutely. Well, with that, Alex, I think it's time to say goodnight. I've kept you here much longer than I originally said I would. I am so stoked that you had fun. I'm really excited that you had a good result, but more than anything, I'm just glad you're enjoying the game still and being you, dude. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
being
yeah,
here and for talking to us about Oscilio.
yeah. Thank you for having me, Bryce. It's always a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, folks, that was another AGE Pro Team Deck Tech, one of the many plethora of videos that are going to be coming out to you on the AGE YouTube channel. Don't 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 spin that dial because we got more stuff coming your way via streamers, via the AGE Open Series coming back next year. Bottom line, we got a lot coming down the pipe. My name is Bryce Platts. My guest, of course, was Alexander Vore, and that's it for us. Have a great evening.